This podcast is brought to you by the School of Advanced Study, University of London.
So the reason we called this what we built as a sort of round table on a Saturday afternoon when there are one or two other events going on which I'm well aware of, but we have to run with the dates that we can get here at the moment. It's obviously the 50th anniversary of the publication of the Making of English Working Class, and I don't think there's been another kind of event here to mark it as such. So it seems, even just for that reason, because this is the centre of UK research history, important to actually just do something about it and put it on the record and so on. So there have, of course, as I'm sure everybody is aware, been a number of events and conferences around the book during the year, each with very sort of different themes. And we talked about doing this, which was quite a bit earlier in the year. I think the idea was that we wouldn't sort of come to sort of praise or damn the book as such, but we'd look at what issues it raised, what the relevance was or otherwise now, what the research agenda might be going forward in terms of stuff that was raised by the book. But obviously, that's up to the individual speakers as to how they actually want to play that. But the world has clearly moved on in some ways since Thompson wrote the book. It was published, and I did once know this, but I've now forgotten, and I can't now find out. But it was published late in 1963. It's extraordinarily difficult to actually find the date when it was published, but it was probably round about now, I think, within a week or two of today, 50 years ago. It was published in hardback by Galant's, rather nasty shade of yellow for those that have seen the hard copy book, not the famous Yorkshire coal miner that was on the front of the Penguin 1968 edition, which is still in print today, but not with that picture, sadly, after some debate, I think, between Dorothy Thompson and the publisher at some point. So that is a little unfortunate. In fact, the last time I saw a copy of it, the picture had on it, I think, was to do with late Victorian England, which is totally outside the period covered by the book. But the publisher's grasp of history is not usually that strong, I fear, so they have a thoughts in mind. Anyway, it was published £3.13 it cost, hardback, in 1963, which was a considerable sum of money. So the sales of the hardback, I don't know exactly what they were offhand, but it was the paperback, of course, which came on 5 years later that really gave it the boost. But so I was saying, things have moved on, so you can now get the book on Kindle, and I can reveal that there was only one mention of beards in the whole book, on page 62, where Thompson notes that the followers of the cult of Joanna Southcott were obliged to wear beards. So now we know.
If we tried to oblige you, you'd shave yours off.
Research has moved on in some ways, because we can now digitally search the book for these kind of things. But in terms of there have been, as I said, not only there was an article last week in the Times High by Robert Coles about the impact of the book and why it was still relevant, and I think probably he makes a point in there which some people may know, is that on a recent edition of University Challenge, Jeremy Paxman asked the brightest and best representatives of whichever universities they were who had written The Making of the English Working Class, and nobody knew the answer. Which is a sad reflection, I think, on the students of today, disgraceful. But it reflects, a number of things. Firstly, that it's 50 years ago, the world has moved on to some extent. Secondly, that Labour history is not taught in universities. It never was to any great extent. So, this is one of this kind of seminar here is sort of one of the survivors, an outcrop of something that was one point could do more common than it currently is. So it's not really entirely surprising, to be honest, that was the case. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to kick off with a few thoughts about one of the concepts in the book that Thompson talks about. He talks about it a lot more in a couple of other published works, both of which are in his later compilation Customs in Common, which is the Moral Economy. Moral Economy has 7 references in the making of the English working class. I can tell you by searching it digitally. So you know, he introduces the concept of a moral economy in the book, and then he goes on to write a good deal more about it. And as some people here will know, it has spawned a vast literature since, and several debates, and it's still a subject of some interest and controversies, as I'll mention here. In terms of a definition of what the moral economy is, although Thompson wrote some length about it, it's quite difficult. I mean, again, we're talking 50 years ago here. The soundbite didn't really exist then, sadly, so he was not obliging in providing a helpful soundbite to which we could sum up the moral economy in 140 characters and send it out on Twitter. So I had to look elsewhere, and Adrian Randall is one of the people that's written quite extensively on the moral economy, has in fact provided a one-line summary that could be tweeted, and his expression of what the moral economy means is: in the marketplace, the crowd expected its measures heaped, not levelled. So, in other words, it's an expectation of, if you like, working or common people about what deal they should get out of the market, what deal they should get out of early capitalism, or capitalism as it was developed. And Randall notes that along with that was a serious contempt for those that were levellers rather than heapers, who he describes as the factor, the forestaller, and the regrater. I'm not entirely sure what regraters actually did, but it sounds...
Holder?
Yeah, possibly. It sounds quite nasty, doesn't it? So, no doubt, some expression of awfulness. And those kind of things, not aside from being regulated from time to time by crowd action and riot, were thrashed out yearly within a customary legal framework, with the sizes of bread, the sizes of ale, where the quality and the price of the staples of the working class, or and in some cases the peasant economy, were checked and regulated. And these kind of things, particularly the sizes of ale, still trundle along today, but they're sort of, excuses for pub crawls really. But the custom, that was the custom, and that's how it was regulated. So that's just a brief sort of background to what is a subject which has a huge literature. What I'm just going to talk about is a little bit about the use that Thompson makes of it, and a little bit about the possible relevance today. So about 10 days ago, I was at an event where I met somebody called Colin Price. Mr. Price is not the kind of person who normally wants to mention in socialist history gatherings. He's the director was a director of McKinsey's, the business consultants, and head of their global organisation practice. And his specialisms are around health of businesses or otherwise. Anyway, at the event, I'll go into the detail of the event, but I was there as a trade union official, not a business consultant. At the event, Price went through a significant list of companies around the world who, for a variety of reasons, have lost both the trust of customers and often much of their business market. As a result, he highlighted in particular the behaviour of the Co-op Bank, which, as it turned out, was the bank he used personally, so he felt quite strongly about this. And he argued that business needed a moral contract with the public, and that this had too often been lacking. And his point, in my view, so this is what I'm taking from what he said, not necessarily what he was meaning, was that while the market economy model certainly could work, too often it did not, because of an obsession with shareholder value, the bottom line, rather than wider values of ethical behaviour. Now, no doubt, the issue could be taken with this perspective, but the interesting point for what I'm saying today was there was a focus on some idea of a moral contract between people and the market and business, which he felt was not currently being observed in many cases. Moving on specifically to the making of the English working class, there are some aspects of Thompson's book which seem outdated, I think, to a modern audience, particularly a detailed emphasis on religion. That is an accurate history, clearly, but given the general lack of knowledge about religion and biblical references today compared to 50 years ago, I think if a new edition were to come out, it would probably require somebody working perhaps in the terms of some kind of additional introduction to explain some of the context of that, because I just think it's quite difficult for somebody, say, in their teens or 20s, looking at those quite large numbers of references to Methodism and the Bible and so on, to really understand why that was so important in a world where it really isn't the central feature of many people's lives. Some people certainly, but not many. But on the other hand, some of the concepts first introduced in the making have become more relevant, I would suggest, over the 5 decades since. And in particular, obviously, I'm here talking about the moral economy. Thompson's frame of reference for the moral economy is Andrew Ure's Philosophy of Manufacturers, published in 1835, which is almost as large a book as the making itself. And that laid out a moral code for the factory system, and in particular for those who worked in it. And it was what we would call today a sort of market economy or neoliberal approach. And a central feature was around things like the time work discipline that Thompson referred to in his famous essay, which is not obviously in the making. And essentially the same kind of approach that we see in the modern workplace as it was in the late 18th and early 19th centuries. But Thompson looked at the value system of those who opposed the factory system and argued that they had a different view of what a moral economy might be. So in some senses what Andrew Ure and others like Adam Smith talk about is a political economy which underwrites the development of capitalism, but they sometimes portray it as a moral economy. And Thompson looks at a different view of what a moral economy might be, a view that is rooted in custom, but also developed in relation and interaction with capitalism as it itself advanced in the late 18th and early 19th centuries. Thompson notes of the 18th century riot, the most common point of popular resistance at that time, that it rested upon more articulate popular sanctions and was validated by more sophisticated traditions than the word riot suggests. He goes on to argue that the main motivation was a moral economy that taught that immorality of any unfair method of forcing up the price of provisions by profiteering upon the necessities of people. So it's looking at what is a moral, what is not a moral view of an economic system. And it sounds remarkably like, if we look at it in that way, the modern discontents over large companies that make huge profits but avoid taxes, or energy companies that charge what are thought to be excessive and unjustified prices. And as Thompson notes in the book, any sharp rise in prices precipitated riot. Not a bad idea, I think, perhaps in some ways. Thompson also doubts how far many riots were exactly spontaneous, arguing that they required more preparation and organisation than is at first apparent. Thompson refers to the theory and practice of the moral economy in the late 18th century as a deeply rooted pattern of behaviour and belief. And he goes on to say that behind every popular form of direct action, there's some legitimising notion of right is to be found. So people feel that the moral economy is based in customary law. This is what is right, and where it's not occurring, that's something in the modern language to be called out and to be opposed. Thompson is trying to make the point, I think, that the concept or category that he of moral economy that he refers to in The Making and in Customs in Common, and backs up with a massive evidence built up over many years, researches and archives and so on, is a time-bound concept. He suggests it relates to a particular moment of capitalist development in the United Kingdom and a particular moment of attempts, if not to resist it, then to deal with it. Thompson is prepared to allow, and he makes this clear in the final pages of his past and present article on time work discipline that I referred to a few minutes ago, that a moral economy very similar to or equivalent to that which he describes may well feature in developing countries around the world into the modern era. But he's much less sure, there's an essay in Customs and Common where he looks at the reactions to the moral economy. He's much less sure that it's correct to take the concept of the moral economy that he develops and apply it, shall we say, to post-1945 Britain. Thompson has got a model of social development that suggests that the moral economy is a defensive strategy designed to try and protect customary rights rather than an offensive strategy designed to promote and advance new rights such as limits on working hours, conditions at work, and so on. These, he sees, is related to the rise of an organised labour movement and a political left that moves beyond defending the past and tries to shape the future. Broadly speaking, I wouldn't dissent from that view. It's a fairly standard kind of Marxist with a small m view, I think. Except that I think there is a case for suggesting that depending on circumstances, it sometimes remains important to defend the past. It might be argued that much of use of the concept of the moral economy today is about trying to defend a fairly recent past when things were a little bit more equal and fair than they currently are. And that might also fit with Thompson's idea that the Victorian labour movement, rather than challenging capitalism outright, which it tried to do in the Chartist period and had narrowly failed to overturn, thinking of the Newport rising in 1839 in particular, instead opted to warren it in Thompson's face from end to end with defensive bulwarks such as trade unions and cooperative societies. These were often about negotiating the terms in which a market economy could and should operate, and again were often underwritten by ideas of a moral economy. Talk of the labour movement as a moral crusade was common, and while some of that was tied into religious thought, some of it was about establishing standards of fairness. So, the kind of summary that I would make, I suppose, is that Thompson is unsure how far the concept of moral economy could and should be used outside of the context of the late 18th century. For Thompson, the moral economy was a customary right, also to be found in common law, which was not used as a challenge to rising market values. It was not put forward as an alternative political economy, but as a corrective and a restraint to it. There's a little bit of a difference between the two. It must be said that, irrespective, notwithstanding what people thought at the time about that, certainly if you look back to the literature around the period of Thompson's essay, those who opposed the points that Thompson were making were not inclined to accept this distinction. Hostile literature invariably comes from the direction that the moral economy is really just some kind of socialist economy, which I don't really think is the point Thompson is actually making, but that's how it's picked up by people that oppose. The opposition comes mainly from right-wing economic historians who, as always, and it's exactly the same now, just argue that, well, the market will just sort it all out, no problem. It's a naturally correcting mechanism. The hidden hand will sort of direct and all will be well, except it won't, obviously, but there we are. So, the idea that there are certain basic human values that people have a right to essential foodstuffs at affordable prices, and certainly prices that do not allow farmers and middlemen to exploit shortages, can be seen to have an application today, and food riots are probably the most common form of riot around the world today, particularly riots around things like the availability and price of bread. So, you know, that I think in a sense makes the point. Does it matter that people today complain about energy prices or large companies that don't pay taxes and see some historical basis for their action? Perhaps not to all the participants, but the underlying concept of the free-born English man, and we'll no doubt touch a little bit more on that point in a while, I think remains an important one. It seems to me it is an important legacy of the making of the English working class 50 years on, and it's a framework we can understand historically from Thompson, and then look to see how it can be applied to a British society more than 200 years after its specific historical usage. It's in this way that the book remains an important work of history, but also something that has a continuing political influence and impact, at least in part, some way beyond where Thompson himself might well have taken it. His work on the business practices at Warwick University in the late 1960s, published as a Penguin Special Warwick University Limited, and his later activity with European Nuclear Disarmament and END, and his focus on what he called endism, underlined that Thompson himself continued to have some workable ethical framework which could be related to the historical capacity of the moral economy. I started the brief paper here by referring to a director of McKinsey's, and I conclude by referencing someone who's probably a little more at home at the gathering of socialist historians, the musician Billy Bragg. Catching him at St David's Hall in Cardiff last week, I heard him talk about how the big issue in society is to move beyond political democracy and make business and the world of work accountable in the same way as political democracy at least is on occasion. He played, of course, power in the union, but what he was saying was an argument about a moral economy in terms of holding business to account in a democratic way, and again that fits in with very much with some kind of concept of that moral contract or moral economy. So while Thompson refers in the making to a last desperate effort by the people to reimpose the older moral economies against the economy of the free market, and has in mind the late 18th century as the appropriate time frame, it may be that this effort, deflected in ways yet to be explored, is still in fact going on. The question is never quite actually settled. So, I'll leave it there and we'll hand over now to Eureka.
Thank you very much, Pete. Hello, everybody. I'm going to begin by an experience I had coming up on the train from Kent to come here. I live in East Kent these days. There are very few black faces around, and a couple of young black women got on at Sittingbourne, and I'm sitting reading this book on William Cuffy. And I'm holding it up like this. And they both look at the book and look at me and look at the book, and I realized they looked so. I said, "Oh, would you like to have a look at the book?" "Oh, yes. Who was William Cuffy? Who were the Chartists?" I said, "Oh, did you go to school here?" "Yes." "Do you have children going to school here?" "Oh, yes. They both have kids in primary school." So we talked about William Cuffy, and then about what is it like for them as young mothers, but with experience of almost all their schooling in this country, to have learned absolutely nothing about any black man or woman in all their many years in school. Both of them are from the West Indies, both came from fairly poor families, so they haven't been back, and they have not kept in touch with the families. So when we talked about how do you retain your culture, how do you become who you are, especially with a black face in this country, and we thought, well, for more recent immigrants, especially those who have money to send children back to families, it's all right. They will speak their language at home, and they will acquire some knowledge of a very different culture, very different traditions, very different ways of being in the world, and where you're not a second-class citizen, in inverted commas. And then we talked about the damage that the schools are doing, where not only as blacks, but as women, they barely exist in the history curriculum unless they happen to be a queen. And certainly they said they learned absolutely nothing about any black person in all their years in schools. And we then talked about how they would have felt about themselves if they had. Not just people of African origins and descent in this country, but maybe learn something about the history of Africa. They have both now done a little bit of reading, and I told them what more to read and what they might get for their children. So as you can see, I'm very full of this and very despondent and angered by it, because I've, together with colleagues, we've been trying to talk to the government about the national history curriculums for about 20 years. And all right, we got Mary Seacole and Olaudah Equiano on there, and Mary Seacole's already been taken off, I believe. I think Equiano is still there. But I had a huge fallout with the government when they were celebrating the 200th anniversary of the Anti-Slave Trade Act, because I was asked to go along to Westminster, and I said, no, where's Equiano? Where's who? So I don't need to bore you with what sort of went on about that, and I didn't attend because I thought I would probably get up and be very rude and...
That would be great.
But it's, So, let me then tell you about how I got involved with Thompson's book. Some of you heard me say I come from a Jewish Hungarian family. And what was left of us emigrated to Australia. And I lived for 6 months in New Guinea, which was my first very direct experience of what racism was about, which was quite horrific. And I married and divorced, and then after getting university miseducation, I think it was, I came here with my son. Now, what you learn in Australia, history is about the British exploring Africa and, exploring Australia. There weren't many people living there, you were told, so there were no problems about taking over all the land along the coast. Well, I, did a bit of reading and realized that was a pack of lies. But I didn't realize how biased the rest of the history was that I was taught, because almost all the history you learn, except for this little bit about Australia, is English history. So you end up with this wonderful glorified image of the mother country, and it was very much the mother country. And in those days, you could buy a car in Europe without paying any taxes if you bought it from Australia. So I bought a car for when the ship docked in Naples, because I wanted to, I'm coming back to Europe, so I want to see Europe, and you can buy a car for very little money. So we drive through Europe, and it sort of lived up to my expectations in a way. And then you come to England, and you land in Dover, and you go to Canterbury, and Canterbury was beautiful, so you're still in mother country, and it's absolute heaven. And then you drive up through the beautiful countryside till you get to the Dartmoor Tunnel. This is 1965. The Dartmoor Tunnel in those days was one lane in either direction and very badly lit, and I thought, what? This isn't right. And then you come out the other side in the East End of London, Now, I had read a lot of novels because I think you learn an awful lot from novels. So I did know something about the East End of London. But what I saw in front of me, I just couldn't believe. I mean, this is the mother country, and people are living like this. And there was still this temporary housing put up for people whose homes had been bombed out. But this is 1965. The war ended in 45. So I think, what? And then you drive through, the rest of London, and you get to what I realised are the middle class areas where everything's been rebuilt and there's nobody living like that. So that was my initial introduction. And then the first job I had was teaching English to immigrant children in Haringey. And I had expected to be teaching English perhaps to kids from Cyprus, instead of which it was a lot of black kids who were sent to my class. And I didn't even know where the West Indies were, because if your education's in Australia, the West Indies don't exist. The Americas are there, but West Indies, good heavens, no. So I have to do a lot of reading. I mean, just, who, what, when, why, and why are they here? And some parents come to pick up the kids, so I go and talk to them and say, please educate me, tell me, explain. And I'm also not understanding why these children are being sent to English classes, because I must have had some form of Australian accent, and they had all kinds of what I realized were West Indian accents, but we were all speaking English. So I eventually, when I became brave enough, because, here I am with a son and no relatives, nobody here, so you don't easily complain because you've got to keep your job right, you've got a boy to feed. And I'm new, and so I went to the teachers of the classes who were sending the kids to me, and I said, why? Well, they're all disturbed, And I thought, disturbed, explain what disturbed means. Well, they all want to sit next to the radiators. They've got to sit where I tell them to sit. And I said, well, do you know why they must be cold if they want to sit? They will sit where I tell them to sit, these two teachers tell me. Now, from what I had learned from the parents, they had come here because there was no work on most of the islands. And at first the men came, and then when they were fairly settled, they brought their wives over. And when they both had jobs and were fairly settled, then they brought the children over who had been left at home with their families. And they often brought the children over the Christmas break, because the factories they were working in were shut down over Christmas. So you could spend 10 days with the children whom often you hadn't seen for 2 or 3 or sometimes more years. So I said, well, of course the children are frozen. Imagine coming here from St. Lucia or Jamaica in, mid-December. You'd freeze to death no matter how many clothes you had on. So I go back and talk with the head teacher, and I'm told I just don't understand, and that the children have to sit where they are told to sit, and no, they cannot sit next to the radiators. Now that was my introduction to teaching here, and in my attempts to try to understand this country, I read Thompson, or I read some of Thompson, because there were certainly social class differences in Australia, and of course the racism against the Aborigines is horrific, but you didn't expect that in the mother country. And even though I had read all these novels about the East End of London and some about Liverpool and even set in Manchester, when you're somehow confronted by such appalling prejudices, you're really sort of shaken down to your boots. You just think, well, what is this about and why is it there? And have people been protesting about this? And you know, what can I do to do my bit of protesting, because this is just totally wrong. So I read Thompson, and I was, not all of him, but I was upset that he in many ways didn't answer my questions, and certainly didn't tell me anything much about the presence of non-white peoples there, or of other peoples. So I began to look at that, and I thought, well, you know, who after all are the English? There are all these people who came, the Celts and the Picts and the Huguenots and the Jews much later, and then I read about the Romans and the many regiments from the different parts of the empire, many of whom stayed here. And I thought, well, why am I not being taught about that? I mean, you know, this is a culture of today, derives from all of that. But you're not taught that, and you can't look at it. So I ended up a very long way down the road, deciding that I could live on whatever work I could find part-time and do some research, mainly on black political activists here. So let me tell you what I think should have been in Thompson's book. First of all, he does deal with the Gordon riots. But there were at least 3 black people who appeared in court for participating in the Gordon riots. And if you look at the major depiction of the riots, you can see 3 black faces within the crowds. So when I begin that research, I think, well, no, maybe this in the beginning was against the Roman Catholics. But by day 2, it's about the rich. It's about the rich, and it's about the poor being imprisoned by their tens of thousands, probably, because in fact they're breaking down the prison doors. So I get a very, very different picture of what the Gordon riots were about, and I find it very interesting that it is still so often depicted as an anti-Catholic riot, whereas to me days 2 and 3 were not about that at all, but about the social class differences. And the 3 black people I found who had participated are very, very seldom mentioned at all. One of them was a black woman who was in fact hung. One of them was released, but told he had to be out of England for at least 3 years. I don't know what happened to the third one. The 2 who were released because their employers came and spoke for them. And it's possible that another person described as a mulatto was hanged. And in the little bits of research I did, I found the report by a prison guard who reports that he saw several blacks and Tawnies, that is mixed race people, among the rioters. Now this is 1780, so it makes you wonder, well, just how many black people were living here? And why don't we know about this woman who's participating in this? You know, so it wasn't just black men living here and taking action, but a black woman also. Now, you know, I don't really know how to research the 1780s, so what I'm telling you is the little bit I managed to find without any skills in that area at all. But it certainly opens the massive door about cooperation between black and white workers in this country, that they're in all this together. That then took me really to William Davidson, who was one of the Spenceans, together with Wedderburn, who is mentioned by Thompson. Wedderburn again, he hasn't been properly researched. He was a seaman and a cabinet maker. A bit like Wedderburn, his ancestry is the same. He had a white father in the Caribbean and a black mother. Of course, all the white plantation owners and managers in the Caribbean felt they had free access to all the black women. The black women couldn't protest. Occasionally the white men recognized their children and freed them, and a few even sent them to Britain, but I really mean very, very few. Most of the time the children were not recognized at all. Now Davison was sent to his father, was the Attorney General in Jamaica, and he joined the Marylebone Union Reading Society, which I believe was formed after the Peterloo Massacre. So when I read that, I thought, well, let me read about the Peterloo Massacre. And then I thought, well, just why is that is never taught anywhere either. And here is the military simply shooting down people protesting for their workers' rights within this country, and they're just coming and shooting them down. I've asked colleagues in Manchester to try to do some research on that, because there was certainly a black population in that area, and I would guess that some of them would have been at Peterloo. There's a massive issue about the legality of slavery in this country. Of course, while Britain passed a law making it illegal to trade in slaves in 1807 and did nothing much to implement it for 40 years, it passed a law making slavery illegal in 4 particular areas. You have to read right to the end of the Act to see this. The second last clause says slaves are freed in Cape Town, Canada, Ceylon, and the Caribbean. The last clause says India is excepted from this act. How many Indians, and I'm not talking of Africans shipped there, but Indians were enslaved at that time, is very difficult to discover, but the minimum number, I'm told, is 8 million. Quite a number, right? Was it legal here? Well, there were many, many court cases, and some judges said yes, and some said no. Lord Somerset did not free slaves here. What he did was say that it was illegal to export people from here to be sold in the Caribbean, or as slaves in the Caribbean. Now, in Manchester, we know from Thomas Clarkson's diaries that he was collecting information on the trade in enslaved Africans in Liverpool, and many people around the country asked him to come and talk, and he was asked to give a talk in Manchester. So he went, and he reports in his diary that there were at least 20 blacks clustered round the front of the church that he was giving a talk in to listen to me. Now, if they were clustered there, it means they were free men, right? I mean, if you're a slave, you're not going to risk being flogged by going to listen to Thomas Clarkson talk about the evils of slavery. So I'm guessing that there would have been black people participating in the Peterloo massacre, which I think had a huge influence on the workers around the country, certainly on Davidson. So he joins the Reading Union, and they hold a lot of discussions, and when I tried to find out why it's called a reading union, I discovered that, of course, most working people had very little money, and many of them couldn't read either because there were no free schools. So the reading unions bought the radical newspapers and pamphlets, and somebody there could read to all the others who couldn't read, because I didn't know all that. Davidson could read. And he, in fact, was teaching reading and writing in a Wesleyan Sunday school because he thought that everybody had to learn to read. He was one of the people who also was trying to organize protests about how the working class, of which he was a part, were being treated. What then happens is that the government sends spies and manipulators into all of these societies. And this manipulator persuades them that they really ought to have a go at blowing up the cabinet, and tells them where to buy or acquire guns and gunpowder, and in fact helps them get some. And the government puts a false report in the newspapers to say where the cabinet will be meeting. And with this spy and maybe another, they get all this stuff together and they're going to blow up the cabinet. Right? But it's all manipulated. It's all done by spies. So, of course, they're taken to court. The spy is immediately given another name and is exported from the country to Guernsey to make sure he will be safe. And Davidson is among those who is executed. There's a fear then that there will be revolts about this, and more people are arrested. So there isn't very much. But what horrified me about the way such workers were looked upon is that the wives of the 5 men who are going to be executed, who were put up to this supposed murder by this spy manipulator guy. The wives go to the government to say, can we have the bodies, please, so we can bury them? And the government then says no and buries them in quicklime in an underground prison passage. You know, and you read this and you think, just how could you, and how could you be so sure that there would be no revolt against something like this? But I think sort of revolts and riots were ongoing at this time. You know, I think the first big one was the Spitalfields riot in 1816, and then Peterloo the same time, and this with Davidson in 1820, and then we have Wedderburn, who was the son of a plantation owner, a Scottish plantation owner, and a slave mother, and comes here and becomes a Spencean and is involved in all the debates and attempts to form organizations after Peterloo. He is also involved with the Irish struggles for a while. And he is more, from what I was able to find, more concerned with the situation in the Caribbean than Davidson was. I haven't been able to find any references to Davidson talking about the Caribbean, whereas Wedderburn does, and attempts to get out pamphlets and newspapers to the Caribbean, smuggled out, I guess, by the black seamen on the merchant boats. But I think he was very hopeful about literacy rates in the Caribbean because, of course, the plantation owners were, the last thing they wanted was for any of their slaves to learn to read. But Wedderburn tried. He is in and out of prison for all of his activism, but continues writing. And it is that Thompson acknowledges. Now, of course, the man who did the most about slavery was Olaudah Equiano, whose book was published in 1789, I think, and was used by Thomas Clarkson and all the others who provided the material that was taken up in Parliament. Equiano was not the only one writing. Ottobah Cugoano also had a book published. And if you read both their writings, they talk not just about the evils of enslaving people, but they also raise issues of equality, I guess because they are living in this country as free men, together with lots of other free black men, but they are part of the working class, so they are seeing and living in another kind of inequality. It was grim enough when they were slaves, but now they are free. But it is still pretty grim. So to me, they are part of the 18th century working class struggles, and I wish that somebody who gets research money and knows how to research 18th century documents and has access to the local newspapers as well would do more research on them. I mean, Equiano was invited to speak around the country. Now, you know, who were the people who were prepared to listen to this black guy? Was it only the handful of abolitionists from the middle classes? That doesn't make enough sense to me. So I would also like to know much more about how working class English people related to slavery and the struggles against slavery. You know, millions of people signed the petitions that went to Parliament. Now, you know, how did working people relate to that? Did they think, well, if I sign that, the next thing will be looking at how I'm treated here? Because certainly the issue of the appalling conditions that many of the white working class were living in and working in here was raised by them. So I think we need to do a lot more research about the cooperation between the black population here, which we certainly did have, and the white working class, because I think it was there. Now, whether anybody will do it in the current climate or get research money, I doubt it. I mean, you might like to know that in all the years that I've been writing, I think my first book came out in 85. I've had 2 research grants, both were travel grants for less than £1,000.
What are the title of the books?
Oh, the first one was it's mentioned in here. It was on workers brought here from the Caribbean during World War II, and then I went on from there. But it's very interesting to me that despite the numbers of books I've written, and I think it's 8 now, and some is self-published because I want to make it a buyable price, but others, like the book about the it's called After Abolition, about how the 1807 Act was a nice piece of paper, but nothing was done about it for 40 years. That's published by Taurus because I wanted a very respectable publisher to put that out. So it's interesting to me that though I've been published by a number of publishers, I don't ever get any research money, and I'm sure that that's a way of trying to stop me doing this research, because we can't have all these black people here, never mind participating in politics. It's just not acceptable at all. I think I'll stop there.
Okay, thanks very much, Marika, for that. That's very. I think we'll give you a. So, moving on then, Peter Dwyer, who's based at Ruskin. I think I suggested to him the idea of doing this, so hopefully he's not about to blame me for dragging him down here, but I'm sure it will be interesting. So, Peter.
Thanks, Keith. Yeah. Sorry, I've got a bad cold, so my voice is not too good. I came to Thompson really late because I studied really late, so I was like nearly 30. In the early 90s when I discovered Thompson and the English, making the English working class. My PhD supervisor said to me the first 2 things you need to read are Thompson's book and Trotsky's History of the Russian Revolution. I thought that's quite exciting. And so off I went, and I was interested in South Africa at the time. And because my undergrad was in development studies. And so at the time, discovering Thompson was really exciting for all the reasons that Marika's pointed out about my own working class history, our history, and about how it speaks to South Africa. And one of the interesting things was the whole notion of spontaneity made me think about who done what and when. And so I ended up looking at the lives of activists from COSATU, the South African Trade Union, and what their role was in the South African liberation movement, and how it impacted them, how it changed, how it affected them. And their sort of, if you like, their real lived experience, sort of phrase Thompson comes to as well. So that was my PhD, and then since then I've been working on South and Southern Africa and other parts of Africa with a couple of colleagues. My former PhD supervisor, David Seddon, and Leo Zelig, that some of you will know. And of course, this, Thompson's work has a lot of relevance for the Global South even now, and that's really what I'm talking to today. Just briefly, I mean, I'm sure some of you know, but it's worth reminding ourselves just how important the book was in places like South Africa. And it fed directly into the liberation movement in the history workshop, which took place at Wits University in Johannesburg, and really Kalina Carson, people like that. They were activists in the movement, and they got black activists into the university and taught them about, how do we learn about our own history, your own history in South Africa, and how could that inform your struggles? So the struggle both scaled the ivory towers, and the ivory towers went outside into the struggle, and I think that's really important. Of course, Thompson's sort of ideas, I think, went on that history from below of that whole group of people, went on to inform some great work about Africa and other parts of the Global South. But in Africa in particular is what I'm interested in. Michael Burraway's work in Zambia, Shula Mark's work in Africa, Charles Van Onson's work in South Africa, and other things like that. So it's at that historical point, and obviously continues to today as well. I'll talk a little bit really about a book that I'm trying to put together with David Seddon and Leo about global struggles sort of since the 90s, and it's based on that type of work we've done. But of course there are other people that have been inspired by Thompson's work in the Global South. I don't know if anybody who read it. There's a great book called Cutting the Wire about the landless workers movement, the MST in Brazil. And the very last chapter is all about Thompson and the influence of Thompson on the writers. And it's right at the very end. It's really, really good. So there's those lessons for Thompson for others as well. So obviously Thompson's work has allowed us to gives us a particular lens through which to review political transformations, and seems no one else has quoted Thompson yet today. I'm going to. I thought it'd be boring by the time he got to me, but no one's quoted him yet. So I'll talk of this lovely, obviously, quote that you all know about from Thompson, where he argues consciously against the whole sort of orthodoxies of the past about history, and a couple of orthodoxies, and then he goes on to talk about the orthodoxy of the empirical economic historians, in which the working people are seen as a labour force, as migrants, or as data for statistical series. He goes on to obviously talk about they tend to obscure the agency of working people and the degree to which they contributed to conscious efforts to making of history. I know this is maybe old hat to you, but it's really worth reminding ourselves of how brilliant this was. And what has always interested me and interested a book that Leo and I had done recently on African struggles was, looking at the blind alleys, the lost causes and the losers, and how they're forgotten and what the lessons are from that. And then Keith reminded me again about a year ago, or maybe a bit less, about a beautiful paragraph towards the end of the conclusion where he says, after all, we are not at the end of social evolution ourselves. In some of the lost causes of the people of the Industrial Revolution, we may gain insights into the social evils which we have yet to cure. Moreover, this is the interesting bit for me, the greater part of the world today is still undergoing problems of industrialisation and of the formation of democratic institutions analogous in many ways to our own experiences during the Industrial Revolution. Causes which were lost in England might, in Asia or Africa, yet be won. And that's sort of informed a little bit about what we're doing in this ideas for this new book about global struggle, which builds on a really path-breaking book by my former PhD supervisor called Free Markets and Food Riots, which was obviously, the nature of the title was informed a lot by Thompson's Moral Economy, to look at bread riots in the past and how they can inform the bread riots that started from the 70s and 80s, that really were the precursors to the movements against structural adjustment and what we call neoliberalism, starting way back in Peru and really revolts against Sadat in the early 1970s in Cairo, the bread riots there. And the book, Free Markets and Food Riots, ends in about 94, 95, and he's been struggling ever since, and we've been struggling the last few years, to update it from 95 onwards, because of the whole number of events and processes that took place since then. So we really want to use 95, which is also the founding, or the refounding of the General Agreements Against Trade and Tariffs, GATT, into its new name, World Trade Organization, and you all know the role of that as one of the many agents of imperialism and neoliberalism in the global south. So we want to use the book and Thompson's work to help us inform, looking at those struggles since 95, to try and move away from, I guess, some sterile debates that had emerged in the anti-capitalist movement about what is and isn't anti-capitalist, and to bring together sort of different strands of our research over the last few years. Using Thompson's idea of looking at people's struggles, they must be embodied in real people in a real context. And this is important because we want to, we've always wanted to try and get over some weaknesses in other work on Africa and elsewhere, which is the weakness to romanticise popular movements of various kinds in post-colonial Africa and post-colonial countries, and of late to forget them. Obvious trends and fragment them and say there's nothing we can say about them, which is obviously nonsense. And so it's an attempt to write back in, a sustained attempt against forgetting, which is what Thompson was on about. And I was just chatting to a very respected and a dear friend in South Africa, writer and activist, and I mentioned about this today, and he said, yeah, there's lots that we've forgotten, but he said, but there's lots we need to forget in terms of the disasters and the problems and the failures that are left. But of course, we still need to look at how we can move on and learn those lessons. Again, something that runs right through the making of the English working class. So our work has really tried to say, look, if we look at struggles and social movements, they really are, and we embody them in real people and real experiences. We can't write in what we think they should do. We can only look at what they did and speculate and think about what we think they might ought to have done, learn the lessons. And that sort of notion of embodied in real people in real context. And if we do that, then we've got a real sense, and I think this is really important, of how these movements are so messy, if you like. I mean, I interviewed a leading activist from the liberation struggle as a trade unionist, and he said, we had all these ideas and study circles on the ground, and we read all the books, and we thought we knew how it should happen, and things happened. He said, but you know what, in the end, it was just so much more bloody messy. And I think that's a fantastic phrase. I've always carried that with me, And again, that bloody messiness, if you like, is something that's very important in reality and trying to look at things theoretically. So if we've got this idea that these struggles, mass movements, are contested, disparate, contradictory, then the important thing about that is it opens us up to the potentials for looking at what are the radical tendencies that may have grown and died out. The people who are lost, the lost causes, the blind alleys. What are the lessons of that? Can we learn anything? And that's something that we're very interested in as well. So avoiding that romanticisation, but also trying to avoid and also critique what became, and I know that the debates that I'm aware of in Thompson's work, of in the global south, of a left nationalism. That only talks about that these movements can only ever be nationalist. Therefore, we need a national liberation that is based on, Africanism. And, we're trying to avoid the weaknesses of that and to debate that, because there has been an overemphasis on that. And there was, on the left, even in Britain, that's where I think a reticence to critique that sort of, if you like, African nationalism or the forms of nationalism. The other thing we want to do in this new book is to also, and obviously this talks a bit of Thompson, is there has been in all our work an overemphasis on urban movements, and we need to think still about the rural movements, because there still are 3 billion farmers, at least peasant farmers in the world, and they'll have something to say about what goes on in parts of the world. So look at that, and also try and avoid the pitfalls of seeing rural people and rural movements as inherently conservative, or a form of petty bourgeoisie that really is often seen as conservative. But we need to empirically look at that and not look at it simplistically with sort of, if you like, preconfigured ideas. There's also the notion that in the last few years, I guess linking from this 95 onwards, the anti-capitalist, anti-globalisation, we've seen a big rise in sort of, if you want to call them, rural movements. The MST, the landless workers movement in Brazil is a good example, and the sort of Via Campesina, this sort of global south organisation that tries to bring rural movements together, and they're very important movements, so we need to look at them and what they do. We know that, yes, we can't deny that some rural movements can be parochial, can be very localised, but the MST and Via Campesina are increasingly interconnected on a global scale and have international reach, which is very, very interesting. Something which I think we've yet to deal about, be interesting to see what people think about, is in terms of that, how do we look at the sort of not only the rural movements that are in parts of South Asia, the continuing Maoist movements, Naxalite movements, the links between the different groups in Nepal and India, for example. How do we think about, if you like, what might be, in some senses, a religious moral economy of an Al-Qaeda, the Islamic movements? How do we think about that? Is that part of movements of the new struggles post-95? Things like that. How do we theorise anything about that? That's something we can't ignore and talk about that. And again, I'd say one of the last main things really, again, is just to emphasise again that being prepared to take on that sort of overemphasised notion of nationalist hagiography that's in a lot of literature talking about the global south that's still there. Of course, it seems a little bit dated now in terms of how many of the post-colonial governments around the world have adopted neoliberalism, but there still was in the early days, and there may well be a shift back to the notion of a centralised developmental nation state as a tool for development in a post-colonial world or post-neoliberal world, and what can we learn from the past about that as well. So that's sort of the background to the book, and that's how Thompson informs our work. And really what we'll do is look at different parts of the global south, look at the rural areas as well, because we still think, even though the big mass movements are what's discussed, often we don't really know that much about, if you like, the nuts and bolts, the inside of these movements. They're still often portrayed as spontaneous, and David said, was at a meeting, a discussion a few years ago, and we mentioned the word spontaneity, and Dorothy Thompson was there, and she got very agitated and said, whenever someone mentions spontaneity, it just means we don't know what went on.
Yeah, precisely.
Which is brilliant. That is absolutely brilliant. That's very important. We bear that in mind, and that's something we bear in mind as well. So that notion of the resistance and what's going on, that reporting of it is in some ways still fragmented and relatively understudied. even today, and particularly the new ones as well. So we want to engage with that and learn more about those movements and look at the immediate scope, but also is there any long-term resonance and what are the lessons from history all the time as well. And of course, you know, the huge revolts in Middle East and North Africa since 2011 has given this sort of idea new impetus as well, as have the sort of recent struggles in Brazil and elsewhere, and Turkey. And just very briefly, last couple of minutes, I won't go into much detail, but what we're looking at, our key argument is looking at the notion of global restructuring since the 1970s, how this gave rise to a number of waves of dissent, initially seen as bread riots and dismissed as bread riots by even surprisingly people on the left as simply spontaneous bread riots and that's it. I mean, even people like what's his name, John Saul, you know, socialist register and people like that were initially dismissive of these riots, and David said and others early on were arguing against that and saying, no, you know, being very short-sighted to do that. And what we've argued is if we move into the 80s and as structural adjustment begins to really embed itself over parts of the global south, we begin to see new waves of resistance that becomes, if you like, more overtly political. And in the 90s that becomes political and more organised in terms of deposing governments. So in a way that these movements dovetailed with the collapse of the Soviet Union and how that, if you like, discombobulated the whole of the left, where those things came together. We mustn't forget, in Africa alone, from 90 to 91, about 39 one-party states were kicked out of power, you know, with movements from below, which was, you know, incredibly exciting and important. So what we've argued is we've seen a shift from what might have been termed economic and social protest. So protest was much more overtly political, and a political composition to it. And we're thinking that this is similar to the shifts that Thompson talks about, how resistance moved from the 18th and 19th century in England and Europe, and how that became more formalised and more overtly political in terms of parties and organisations. Of course, we've got to learn the lessons of that. And one area, I won't go into today because it's not really the theme of this, but one thing we need to look at is how, if you like to speed up history, how that shift into politicised, more articulated but formal political forms, we need to reflect on that. What happened to the great movements that went into the Labour parties, the social democratic movements of the West, if you like, that ended up in, you know, all sorts of variants of social democracy, Eurocommunism, and, you know, the relatively modern heirs to that in terms of the Greens. You know, mustn't forget they were the great big hope of, you know, the 60s and 70s and the New Left. What happened to them? Well, you know, they ended up supporting the bombing of various parts of the world, you know, having come from a pacifist background. So there will be sections in the book on other parts of the world, not just the global south as well. But really, just to end, I think what's been really exciting and kicked us up the arse to get working on this again is obviously the great revolts that have taken place since 2011. And really, for us, the Egyptian and the Tunisian revolutions, and they were revolutions, were the first, if you like, sustained mass political revolts, great mass revolts in the true sense of that word, against neoliberalism that we've seen, and of course have spilled over into revolutionary processes as well. So, you know, what can we learn from those lessons? And just to end, I mean, really, I thought I'd be a heretic and everyone would be quoting Thompson. I was going to end on two quotes that weren't from Thompson, but I'll do that. But there is one from Thompson I want to use anyway because no one else has used Thompson. But there's a fantastically interesting quote article in the FT about a year ago by Gideon Rachman. And I'll quote him directly because this is fascinating for all of us for many reasons, but in terms of even looking at the global south, he says, "Old certainties about the onward march of markets are collapsing, but no new theories established ideological hegemony," to use that concept from Gramsci made famous, he says. "Some ideas are, however, gathering new strength. The four strongest emerging trends that I can spot are, in very broad terms, right-wing populist, social democratic Keynesian, libertarian Hayekian, and anti-capitalist socialist," which for me is fascinating given that the FT was, you know, obviously the cheerleader of the collapse of communism and the, you know, pushing the idea of the end of history. So that was interesting. Again, how does this fit into our broader thesis about structural capital restructuring itself globally in different places in different ways over time? Well, I mean, a beautiful quote from Crampton when he talks about a crisis occurs, sometimes lasting for decades. This exceptional duration means that incurable structural contradictions reveal themselves, and that despite this, the political forces that are struggling to conserve and defend existing structure itself are making every effort to cure them within certain limits and to overcome them. And it is upon this terrain that the forces of opposition organise. And in that sense, that's what I think fits very well with our research about the global south and that structural crisis from the 70s. But I would just, if I can find it, there's a nice quote from Thompson when he's talking about the resurgence of struggles and how to think about it at the start of the Making the English Working Class, which I think again is very, very interesting in terms of how we understand new struggles emerging today. He says, "It is the old debate continued. The same aspirations, fears and tensions are there, but they arise in a new context with new language and arguments and a changed balance of forces. We have to try to understand both things, the continuing traditions and the context that has changed. Too often, since every account must start somewhere," and here's the warning for all those awful academics, "we see only things which are new."
Very thought-provoking piece. Really interested to see the book when it appears, hopefully not before too long, unlike books that I do. Okay. Next, Logie Barrow, who we are considering the Institute of Historical Research in the centre of London, so imperial categories apply. So Logie is here representing, as he reminds me, the rest of the world, according to the official register.
Yeah, that's only that's not my claim, that's their claim. Yeah, that's
like
their category.
MCC versus the rest of the world. I think that's probably what they had in mind when they put that there. But Logie.
Yeah. Okay, thanks Keith, and thanks everyone for coming, unless you'll rush away, including to me. I'm going to be reading it. Please tell me if I read too fast. In his preface to The Making, Thompson insisted that the working class, quote, not only was made, but made itself, unquote. For this, Perry Anderson labelled him idealist. Recently, as part of my degeneration into an incontinent toddler habitually peeing on the shoulders of successive giants, I have criticised Eric Hobsbawm, dead giants, Eric Hobsbawm for distorting or otherwise underplaying potentials in favour of, in his phrase, in Hobsbawm's phrase, what happened. On this, I would see Thompson as much more sympathetic. Over decades, till around 1990, some of us heard Stalinist renderings of the Internationale as not uniting the human race, but as dividing it. The Stalinist rendering told left-wingers in the West that those in the East who behaved like those left-wingers did in the West were their enemies. Those who tried to engage in anything like class struggle, free of ruling party infallibility, were pro-capitalist. Simultaneously, Western propagandists were reinforcing that logic from the opposite end. This mutual reinforcement sowed fundamental confusions. In many countries it still does. After 1956, the post-Stalinist Edward Thompson was of course among those most loudly resisting one pre-1991 collapse of the Soviet Union effect of these. The tighter locking of hundreds of millions of people into another mutuality, that of nuclear annihilation, which we are now being told today, sometimes happened more nearly than we were being told at the time. By contrast, even some Trotskyists critically supported the degenerated workers' states H-bomb. With hindsight, 11 years after Stalin's physical death, 1953, were particularly fraught for Europe's not-so-post-Stalinist regimes. From widespread demos and strikes throughout East Germany during 1953 itself, via similar and potentially far bloodier events in Poland during 1956, via the building of the Berlin Wall against a different kind of mass movement, migratory, to the long little-known shootings of worker demonstrators in Novocherkassk during 1964. Above all, Hungary's 1956 revolution, workers' councils, a general strike triggered by regime reaction to a demo in support of Polish anti-Stalinism, a supportive peasantry, the lot, took place in the glare of worldwide publicity, though predictably the media preferred photographable tumults and triumphs of horrors in Budapest to from-below organising throughout the country. There can thus be little surprise that the ensuing months saw roughly 1/3 of the CPGB's membership from all walks of life resigning or being expelled. Here, irrelevantly, there should perhaps be more explaining to do as to why far smaller percentages left some other communist parties. Symbolically, the article in Dorothy and Edward Thompson and John Savile's oppositional New Reasoner, in which they courted expulsion, was entitled Amid the Smoke of Budapest, being written while reeling at the latest news that a second Soviet intervention had just started. Despite its length, or perhaps not, Thompson's Making is in some ways the most influential book in 20th century English history book in 20th century English. Citation indices, I don't know whether you know this, have long rated one or more phrases in the preface as amongst the most quoted, though often how adequately understood is surely beyond even Big Brother's finest algorithms in Cheltenham or Fort Meade. The book came out a mere 5.5 years after The Smoke of Budapest, unquote, and though explicitly focused on England and not even on Britain, opens with one anti-Anglo-centric gesture, causes which were lost in England might in Asia, Africa yet be won. From 1963, supporters of peasantist shortcuts, Maoist, Guevarist or whatever, seized on this for their own purposes, before it was used in better ways, as you've explained, as Peter's explained. But Thompson's might is more sophisticated, and given our now half-century of globally accelerating proletarianization, more prophetic. True, that sentence of his may be read as implying that his here unnamed causes had been definitively lost, but I doubt if he meant that. True again, he may or may not have been out of touch with, in Britain, the booming of local, often overwhelmingly unofficial, class struggle, which had been gathering pace from the 1940s and was due to persist through over 4 decades. But his resoundingly public late 1960s rage at discovering that Warwick University was monitoring those students who were very much in touch with those unofficial struggles underlines where his sympathies lay. All this, however, should increase our surprise at less than 7 years after Budapest's smoke. There is a significant silence in that phrase, some words such as or Central and Eastern Europe, unquote. I will try to explain this silence in 2 dimensions which cannot easily be weighed against each other. Secondly, Eastern Europe, but firstly, younger brother Edward's version of Englishness. Inferiority complexes are often lifelong. From his most vulnerable years, Edward knew he was seen as less brilliant than his elder brother Frank, whose education their parents prioritised. Whether much more expensively depends on the value of the scholarship Frank won to Winchester Public School. I personally, as someone whose parents had not allowed him to sit that scholarship exam, remember passing 24 or more times a week the name of one, quote, Frank Thompson, comma, with Bulgarian partisans, unquote, in the memorial cloisters there. During 1959 to 62, I found that far more interesting than merely, say, over Cologne, unquote. But to my guilt-ridden mind, all boys at Winchester, alive or dead, including me, were suspect, and I never connected Frank with this Thompson with the, I felt, sympathetic but intimidating rhetoric I was trying to grasp with every issue of New Left Review, which I took from 1959. As Frank had had far more direct experience of pre-1945 radicalisms in areas that would soon be Stalinized or soon again Titoized, we may doubt whether he would have remained in the party even till 1956, but we cannot know any more than we can know in what political direction either brother would have ricocheted with or against each other out of the CPGB. Edward repeatedly approached politics and history as a reader of literature. His original literary focus had been not on Christopher Hill's Andrew Marvell, but on the English Romantics. Of course, literary passion in itself is hardly a fault. I have to say that because I'm a literary Philistine, although I warm to much of Edward's fiction and poetry. But perhaps relatedly, his polemics, whether against Perry Anderson and Tom Nairn, or against Althusser and followers, or around the post-Polish Leszek Kolakowski, are all too often about not the apparent target, but rather about a literary sensibility called Edward Thompson, who piles simile on metaphor, sometimes over tens of pages, leaving at least some readers feeling far more bewildered than those of the later Doris Lessing, me at least. Frank seems to have been joyfully polyglot. I doubt whether, as Edward, he would have appeared to behave as if unpretentious English were unique in its closeness to reality. Of course, where Edward was literarily complex, that measured both his own brilliance and the sins of those he was attacking. In most languages I have heard of, we make experience. In English, we simply have it, as if it was simply there, and we have just found it. Edward, in a very English way, always wrote and spoke as if he had simply found his targets blocking the road in front of him, or, as the recent expression allows us to say, as if he was simply naming an elephant in the room before going further and finding another one. In his Poverty of Theory, his contempt for Althusser boils down to seeing that PCF philosopher as a naked emperor of circular argument, of tautology, too grand for anything empirical. That is my summary, and I agree that Althusser was tautological, was circular in argument. Such a figure deserved no politeness. The very competence of Thompson's frequent literary references, nearly all to English writers over recent centuries, spreads the impression that English should be defended as a language of peculiar clarity. Perhaps his causes in Asia and Africa would be stronger, the better if articulated in English. Maybe I'm being silly here, I don't know, here at least. This helps power his animus against those comrades, not least those who had replaced him on the board of New Left Review, as horrors after pretentiously strange gods, mostly Parisian. Modish mutterings about last instance determination or deepened reading, Althusserian phrases, meant, we might say, that the frogs were already clambering across Pevensey Beach while Althusserian Stiggons were readying the crown of England, or rather of English, for King Louis the Conqueror. Further, any child who pointed out that emperor's nakedness was always going to be ticked off for rudeness. This allows many of my then or still more or less Althusserian friends, traumatized by the colossal debate at the November 1979 Ruskin History Workshop, to remember less the Poverty of Theory's explosion of Althusser than Thompson's personal animus during that thunderous session, 900 people, immediately against Stuart Hall for trying to shield Richard Johnson, but somewhere also against Hall for helping, decades earlier, to ease Thompson away from New Left Review. When Thompson had left the CPGB, he did what he was much later to compliment Rudolf Barrow with doing after leaving East Germany. He hit the ground running, unquote. The practicalities of being the main or loudest ideologue activist of the early New Left was soon succeeded, thanks to the impact of the making, by those of being a prof at Warwick University. Thompson also invested enormous energies in agitating against nuclear catastrophe, against what he came during the early 1980s to identify as the mechanisms of catastrophism. Of course, by 1973, Thompson remembered himself a decade and more early as, quote, attempting around 1960 to improvise movements out of attitudes. But even if we should see this as a jokey aside, it underlines how his routine orbited between Labour Party meetings and CND, later END, European Nuclear Disarmament ones. He might, as in his 1969 Warwick University Limited, defend those who sought to link shop floor or building site struggles, but he did not seek to help to do so himself. The same applies here, secondly, with Central and Eastern Europe. But here there are also objective factors that were not even the remotest sense his fault. Some of these factors were positive. The urgency of linking with movements for peace which were not stooges of any one-party regime, or as Thompson would have said, of one side in the exterminist dance. If sometimes linkage also helped some movements into existence in the first place, then all the better. Here's conjuring again, question mark. Self-evidently, intellectuals of any kind were far more reachable than any other social group. You can hardly relate to smoke, whether in Budapest or anywhere else, years after workers' councils had been drowned in blood, expunged, and rule by informers' whispers restored. How hardly let my following brief absurdity exemplify. After joining IS in March 64, quote, neither Washington nor Moscow, as some may recall, one of my more private activities was now and then to slink into Cambridge University's language lab at times when it was unlikely to be full. There, to lesson 13, I taught myself what seemed to be Hungarian. If the working class was one, I hoped to experience a hint of this, however microscopically, however indirectly. Away from my dilettantishness, I had no plans except to warm up briefly in central Budapest, and then, if anything interesting had happened, to take a tram or two to Chepel, where 10 years earlier it had been the industrial centre of working class defiance against Soviet repression. In August 1966, the State Tourist Office at Budapest's Western Station allocated me a room nearby with an old man who turned out to look slightly afraid of me. This should have been a warning. I dumped my bag in the room and hurried into the late afternoon. I walked past a few tram stops and selected my first guinea pig. I smiled non-committally and began, in my best Hungarian, a lot there are, England in, unofficial strikes. Okay, good IS stuff in it. Yeah? He looked startled and noticed a little too suddenly for spontaneity that some tram steps had rolled in just a yard from his left foot. In he jumped and away. I didn't follow, being wary of confined spaces, microphones, informants. I walked past a few more tram stops, but my second victim rolled his eyes at me. Instantly, even I understood that I was one of the biggest fools in human history, not the bloodiest, merely the biggest. If, even in the loud acoustic of József Attila Ut, anyone I talked to felt endangered by my trying to start a conversation that could be steered towards workers' councils, then how much more might I endanger any worker I approached in Chepel? As you may imagine, the following day spent in Hungary and the ensuing 10 in Romania and Yugoslavia are irrelevant here. If anyone I hoped to speak to saw me as endangering them, then how many Hungarian-speaking years would have to elapse before I could have one honest conversation? There seemed no point in hoping for casual coincidences on the street, so I was all the more interested, around, I think, 1990, I don't think I fantasized this, to hear rumours that Honey Cliff had been organising some classes in Russian, only to give up the idea of such visits for reasons that never reached me, even in rumour form. Can anyone correct me here, please? As far as I know, i.e. not much, Thompson seems to have been silent as to what had gone wrong in post-1917 Russia, and when and how inevitably. Possibly he held Isaac Deutscher's Trotskyism, increasingly accommodationist to what happened, Stalinistically, in esteem as high as did some of his friends, such as Saville or Rafe Miliband, or some of his bitter rivals around the New Left Review. If anyone knows of any remarks he made about Tony Cleveland-Goldluckstein's use of the concept of state capitalism as defining the system both East and West, or even about Mike Kidron's theory of the permanent arms economy, surely relevant to any CND-END, I would love to hear. Saville's autobiography recounts 3 interviews with Jerry Healy, during which Saville concluded that Healy's narrowness went with a certain lunacy, we might all agree. Admittedly, some Stalinists would have developed reflexes against anyone labellable as Trotskyist, and some may have continued on the alert for the worst in any such. But has anyone found any reasons why so few new lefts felt kinship with, say, Cornelis Castoriadis, Paul Cardin, or with Maurice Brinton, Chris Pallas? Possibly they sensed a self-righteousness in these anarcho-socialists, which they knew from within themselves, more or less. If so, we are in no position to say whether they were oversensitive here. In sum, I do not know whether, after circa 1960, the most daring and eloquent historian during the British left's whole history simply washed his hands of those in nearby Central East European countries' working classes whose self-sacrifices he had belatedly started applauding, or whether he saw them pragmatically as unreachable. If the latter, then some of us can object that unreachability does not lessen the need to occasionally go through the motions, at least, of saying anything to any of them, however indirectly, in the hope of getting through somehow and sometime or other some international and other socialists sang the Internationale outside the Polish embassy in support of the imprisoned Jacek Kuron and Karol Modzelewski one winter's dusk around 1990 to, so far as we could tell, some pigeons too fat to fly to Stepney, let alone to say Szczecin. But Thompson saw the physical survival of anyone of any class as logically prior to trying to revolutionise the working class anywhere. That logic is irrefutable, but it was never the sole liberatory logic in town. My suspicion is that he did not wash his hands of workers surviving under Stalinism and perhaps struggling unreportedly against it. Why else would the author of the then only 10-year-old making criticise Leszek Kolakowski for allegedly presupposing culture and rationality to be, quote, the perquisites, the monopoly, the privilege of intellectuals, with workers or illiterate peasants as inert or cultureless, waiting for intellectuals to drive, unquote, from Thompson. Thompson's sneers were often too English, but they were sneered for proletarian democracy. To end with more vulgarity, he habitually pissed in the best direction. He was not anti-intellect. He was anti those intellectuals, or anyone else for that matter, who omitted the radical democracy from socialism and to confused Marxism with, in the words of the song sung without satire in East Germany into 1989. I know this because I saw it on East German television. My flat in Bremen was cabled. Yeah, into 1989, praising Die Partei, die hat immer recht. The party, it is always right. Thank you.
Thanks, Logie. And finally, before we have a break and so on, Steve. Steve.
Let me pass my chocolate bit. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Do you want to drink?
No, I don't want a break. Does anybody else want a chocolate?
Pass the biscuits around first. I won't go at all.
Sorry, I wasn't going to stop you.
No, that's a good idea. Right. Okay, I won't be too long, so you don't need too many biscuits to keep going. I mean, it's... Okay, my paper is slightly different in that I'm not sure I'm covering anything terribly new, and it's not focusing beyond work that's probably already been done and you know about. What I want to do though is to try and draw some links, and I did say from the beginning, my own background is Reading Williams. That's my area that I work on and currently editing a book on, etc. So that's I come from a slightly different angle to E.P. Thompson. And so I'm involved with various things, the Reading Williams papers, etc. Okay, first thing I think I'm going to say about Thompson is this myth of Thompson the parochial English. There's the peculiar thing about the CP historians that they tended to write, many of them, in an English context, and Victor Kiernan's an exception to that. And of course Hobsbawm is an exception. But many of them, I mean Hill very obviously, Hilton, many of them in English context. And we forget just how international that generation was. It was hugely international. Particularly through war service. I mean, it's an irony that the great claims of internationalism of the 60s, and yet it was the 40s generation actually have been around the world, albeit in service, etc. And Henry Thompson, he starts long before the war. His parents, his father in particular, was a Wesleyan mission. Part of the time in West Bengal, where he began translating Rabindranath Tagore's work, which he continued to do when he came back to England in Oxford. It seems as though that the sort of Edward Thompson Senior was a very good-natured liberal, shall we say, for a very long time, was slowly being drawn, though, towards the Indian independence movement. And Thompson talked about people like Nehru, etc., actually visiting their house in Oxford. So I had this lovely idea of sort of Nehru sort of doing the odd sort of swinging in-swinger of a cricket ball into a young sort of Thompson, you know, in the back garden kind of thing. But clearly he's growing up in a household which is very far from insular, which is very far from the ideas of parochial English. In fact, quite the opposite. His father is regarded as quite dangerous at Oxford for his support and contact with the Indian independence movement. So I think there's one kind of myth that we need to sort of get rid of. And we can further get rid of that myth in a moment's time when we talk about Sir Thompson's own European experiences. But I think, first of all, the Indian experience is very important. One thing that struck me, and this is totally my ignorance, I wasn't aware, for instance, after Thompson died, of a book called Alien Homage. Now, that book seems to have been published and disappeared, which is about his father and Tagore's relationship, and yet that book seems to not be there. It came out at the same time as Witness Against the Beast. Now that's been much talked about. The Tagore book has just seemed to be not there. Samit Sarkar, who's a writer with the one-time Subaltern Studies, and I was thinking about your paper with Subaltern Studies being an example. Mapping the Territory, what it's called, is a book talking about the development of Subaltern Studies that Samit Sarkar writes in. And he says how Thompson, Williams and others were hugely important to their early discussions. And of course, if you look back at the Indian independence movement, a great deal of that was happening in and around London. The Indian YMCA, I believe, is one of the places where people were meeting, etc. And there were other places around London. So that kind of radicalism was linking in and out of the Thompson family. They were really aware of this. Okay, so that's one thing. I think that sort of the Thompson myth of insular, and I think some of that, I dare to say this, but I think a bit tongue-in-cheek, I think a little bit of that came out of the whole sort of culturalist, structuralist debate, in which to be international was to read certain writers but not others, and you were properly international if you read Altus there, but you weren't so properly international if you read somebody else. So there was an element of sort of painting Williams and Thompson as being somehow parochial, whereas, of course, Terry Anderson is a great international figure, etc. In actual practice, Thompson is far more international. It was real life than many of those that came later, as too a number of the others. Victor Kiernan spent a number of years in India, he too translating from Sanskrit into English. Okay, that's one point. I'm interested trying to get the dates of Thompson going to Cambridge, joining the CP and being called up. And I've managed to find out that most writers disagree on the dates. It's quite peculiar, but somewhere around 41, 42. But there are various disagreements. And apparently I was wrong in what I wrote in a book called Making History. Dorothy apparently told me off to somebody else. And I got the date wrong, that he went up to Cambridge as well. So there seems to be some debate about it. Somewhere 41, 42. He does go up. I'm not sure when he gets his war service, whether that included North Africa or not. But he talks about the Italian campaign. It does, right.
North Africa, Italy.
It is, thank you. I wasn't sure. I always think that the Italian campaign, but I hadn't seen whether it was North Africa. Right, so this would have been after Alamein?
I don't know.
Right, okay. That's something. But it's interesting again that Thompson, in his war experience, and I think there's an awful lot being missed about this, is again with international sort of contacts going on, and he would have been aware, at least, of some of the other work. Now, it's very difficult. He was a tank commander. I don't know much about Thompson's experience of being a tank commander, but I know a lot about Williams' experience as a tank commander. Dwyer Smith's fantastic warrior. What are they calling him? Warrior, anyway, something. So, you know, if you were a tank command, I mean, William's war was a very bloody war. He has an absolutely awful war. He was at the forefront from Normandy through more or less the German borders. So he saw an enormous amount of death and killing. I don't know how much Thompson was, but if you were a tank commander, there was very little time to do things like party work, etc., or any kind of education classes at all. It's extremely difficult because you've been shot at, basically. So you know, there wasn't a lot of time of talking. So it would be interesting to know how much Thompson actually did carry on his sort of CP dimension in a way which Eric Halbersborn was able to, because he was working for the Education Corps in the war, so he was able to sort of carry on some of his party work. We don't know that Thompson would have been able to. Well, whether he had any contact with communists, etc., and socialists through Italy. But anyway, that's something that's difficult to explore in his case. Okay. His father died 46, which is when Thompson completed his studies. We know he did this extra year at Cambridge reading literature, which he was particularly keen to go and do. Interestingly, Dorothy had joined the Young Communist League back in '39. So I'm not sure who was leading who there between Dorothy and Edward. It sounds to me a bit like that Dorothy may have been taking the lead over him in terms of, sort of the party. We know that Dorothy was more involved with the historians group than he was. So that's another dimension. Okay. Next big internationalism about two of them, of course, is the Yugoslav railway line, where they spent a year. Now, I think it's 47. I'm pretty sure it's 47 that they're in Yugoslavia. Again, some people can disagree. And they write this book about the railway when they come back, which is one of the very few books I've actually seen about it. It's quite odd how so little has been written on that. In that, he says the only country noticeably missing from the youth railway line was Russia, interestingly. And of course, it's just after the youth railway line that then the whole change comes about, and sort of Tito is branded as etc., alongside all this. So that must have had an enormous influence. Now, you were saying about certain things we don't know of Thompson's responses about workers movement, particularly in the East. We don't know enough yet, I don't think, about Thompson's responses to Yugoslavia. Do we? I'm not sure. I don't think we do. But it must have been very interesting to have come back from this amazing camps, and Thompson talks about how these camps worked, etc. Although talking to somebody else who's at the camps, I think Thompson slightly overdoes the sort of we're all up here sort of working together kind of stuff and singing songs around the campfire. But still, nonetheless, it is an amazing experience to have done this. And apparently the railway was built sort of under budget and ahead of time, which is better than most capitalist organisations tend to do. So anyway, but then again, an example of Thompson being involved in an international dimension, and a very real one in the post-war scene. I think actually the influence of Yugoslavia was probably very much wider on a lot of people, and the visits to Yugoslavia were quite widespread. I think Klugsman went over there too, and he was involved in recruiting some of the... Klugsman was a CP official, if you like. He was involved in recruiting some of the young people to go, as I understand it. I think Raymond Williams dropped in, but I think it was no more than that. It was kind of in passing. Okay, Thompson goes off, Dorothy, sorry, I should say two of them, go up to Halifax, 48. Despite, again, there seems to be some disagreement about sources, but I'm pretty convinced he's appointed as a tutor in literature. Yeah, right, not history. Okay, fine, because some writers have said he's appointed as a tutor in literature, in history, sorry. Right, I think it's literature. Okay. That's another interesting dimension, of course, which we haven't really been able to pick up, but the fact that actually Thompson is very influenced by the sort of the contemporary literary trends associated around sort of scrutiny, etc. And it seems as though his literature classes but pretty orthodox. Thompson doesn't do anything very radical at all. You know, he wants them to learn Shakespeare. He stays pretty much within the code of the adult education WEA formats of classes and what the reading list is. So there's nothing very obviously radical at all going on. He's obviously very aware that this is end of the 40s, into the 50s. There's a huge watch on. I mean, there is sort of whiffs of McCarthyism going on. Adult education is one of the places where communists, in fact, do hold on. They don't lose jobs, and in fact, some of them still get jobs. It's very. I think there's an awful lot missed in not studying adult education in terms of where ideas later came from. Raymond Williams, of course, famously says, you know, cultural studies, well, this is a bit of a joke. We were doing that for years now in education. When we came to the university, they suddenly decided they had to call it something, so they invented the term cultural studies. You know. So I think if you want to trace that through from the 30s, because the other dimension here, which I'm interested in how much Thompson was influenced by in terms of international influences, was that people escaping Nazi Germany, those that settled in England, weren't given, and very often, internal departmental jobs. They weren't trusted in universities. They did get jobs in adult education, interestingly. So once again, I'm sort of trying to trace that through a bit. What people like Mannheim, etc., what influence they may have been having in adult education movements, and was that creating some of the new thinking areas of literature and history? Okay, I'll say a bit more about that in a moment. Right, so Thompson in West Yorkshire is pretty orthodox as far as we can see. He doesn't do anything terribly radical in terms of his class teaching at all. There is a slow shift towards more social history teaching over the 15 odd years that he's working for Leeds. And there's a bit of a debate as to how much his work on Morris from 55, or up to 55 rather, influences that. But there does seem, Thompson saying, a reluctance. He couldn't get students to want to read Morris. They regarded Morris as being a bit sort of an old fuddy-duddy, not terribly interesting, to be honest. Thompson, I imagine, was quite exasperated about this. But there's certainly, Thompson is saying, Morris leads me towards being a historian. There seems to be, Thompson is saying, that's how I got into it. He gives an interview which came out of a Radical History, an American publication, in which they sort of say, well, when did you become a historian? So, well, I didn't kind of make up my mind one morning to become a historian. I kind of got slowly led into it. And that would fit with the adult education style of classes. Because although you were a tutor in literature, I'm trying to say, you wouldn't then sort of stick to a rigid curriculum that you might do in an internal teaching department. You would be able to do things which were more open, more floating, more fluid, and people would bring experience. So there wasn't quite this sort of rigid academic demarcation, which sort of came in later. Okay, so there's the sort of slow shift towards Thompson and history. Right, now I'm going to try and get to one other element, and I'm saying it's the making of the making, and I hope some of these things, one of my points being, I think it has been picked up here in various other papers, the internationalism dimension, that it's not reflected in Thompson's writing, but it is certainly there in the person. Okay, now I want to just move on to bring Thompson a bit nearer to Raymond Williams, and I think so we can begin to see some of the playoffs here. I've literally spent several days now rechecking a lot of references around things like The Highway, which was an adult education journal, the Tutor's Bulletin, and then in the CP, a journal called Arena, which probably anyone's probably ever even seen. Actually, I'm glad I said that because it just reminded me. I'll pass these round. I'm sorry if you've seen these, but there is a copy of New Left Review. Very early ones, the 1 to 12. Remember those? Yes. And that's New Reason. I've found them in odd sort of junk shops and what have you. You pick these things up. Ah, yes, look at that. I've got a ULR somewhere. Actually, yes, I know, definitely tucked away. The thing I also collected was a copy of The Reasoner which I could only borrow, and there's a copy of it itself, so that we just do the Slug of Budapest. And the other thing I got was probably a complete set of the Politics and Letters, the Raymond Williams early journal in 47 too. And that's all very interesting and relevant to what I'm going to say now. Okay, so I'm going to look at these two figures. Williams, as I say, is my primary area of research, so I'm just going to say briefly, what happens with him is he completed his war degree. They had a special thing at Cambridge called a war degree, in which you were allowed to do an intensive study in place of certain other kinds of ordinary studies, you know what I mean? You're allowed to do a thesis in a sense. And he does a thesis on Ibsen. And he gets a job, Sussex, East Sussex into Kent, teaching, well, in Raymond's words, he said, I was meant to be teaching international relations, but strangely they turned the literature classes. I'm not quite sure how that happened, he says, you know. But anyway, he gets the job down there, and he gets in with various people. Wolf Mankiewicz is one, Collins, I forget the person, not Henry Collins, his brother. And they start this journal, Politics and Letters. They want to combine a sort of left politics with scrutiny-style criticism. That's the sort of the bridge they're trying to do. Williams always insists that scrutiny is more important than Leavis himself, incidentally. This is much wider, too, than Leavis himself. And that's their aim. If you read, I'm sure everybody has at some time or other, the big interview, Politics and Letters, you know, with New Refugee, which I have to admit, at times does annoy me, that book. You know, I can sense so much of Perry Anderson wanting to bang on about something happening in Eastern Europe, which doesn't seem to be terribly relevant, because at some of the time it seems to me. But anyway, okay. And it does keep wondering about the 1917 and what Lenin said. I keep thinking, actually, Perry, I wish you wouldn't keep sticking that into the questions. But anyway, in that book, Politics and Letters, he talks about how the journal Politics and Letters folded. And it seemed as though it was practical matters. I mean, they managed between them to get a war ration of paper, which helped. They managed to get some circulation in the adult education movement. But it seemed as though the practicalities that Wolf Mankiewicz is carrying the bulk of the work in London, Clifford Collins is contributing. But Clifford is clearly becoming unwell, and that's just, we don't quite know what happened there, but something happens with Clifford. And Raymond is snowed under with these classes, so he can't actually get up to London very often. The journal falls apart. But, Raymond says, it's interesting how I remember it as being these practical details. I suspect there were deeper underlying matters around culture and politics. Or letters and politics, if you like. Okay, that's happening. That's around 47, 48. So I then sort of looked across and I thought, well, hold on, what's Thompson up to? And I discovered, well, 49, he's writing The Condition of the Arts in the Highway. Now, we don't know at this stage how much Williams we know says, I did not personally know Thompson at this stage. But it's interesting, Thompson's talking about The Condition of the Arts in the Highway in 49. In 1950, in the Tutor's Bulletin, he writes A Cultural Policy. Okay. So then I look across and I think, okay, what's Williams up to now? Well, 51, he joins Freddie Bateson, and in starting up a journal called Essays in Criticism, which is still running. Now, Freddie Bateson is a socialist, and again, like their journal Politics and Letters, it is deliberately aimed across the post-war barrier. Politics and Letters has a number of CP contributors. Christopher Hill, for instance, Henry Collins. Again, Essays in Criticism deliberately wants to attract people from Eastern Europe as well as the British CP. So it's trying to break over that Cold War barrier. What then struck me, well, that's very interesting, because coming the other way in 52 is past and present, which comes from inside the CP, but is deliberately trying to get non-communists or Marxists to contribute to that. whether or not, obviously I suspect there's no knowledge at all between essays in criticism and past and present. However, it's interesting, these two journals at this time are both trying to do something of crossing the Cold War barriers from opposite sides. Okay, Williams in 50 brings out his book Reading and Criticism, and in 52 Drama, Ibsen to Eliot. They're perhaps not so terribly relevant. The Reading and Criticism book is a kind of adult education class book, how to use it, how to do certain work for a student. The Ibsen Eliot is a much more important book. But in 53 comes something very important, is the idea of culture, which he brings out in Essays in Criticism. Now, that is one of the first essays that substantially begins to shift the ideas of culture. It's a hugely important essay. And then finally in 54, Drama and Performance comes out. Okay, 55, out comes Morris. So what I'm getting at here is that while in other words, just in the years of the early 50s, we all talk about 56, and we'll do in a second, as though, as Richard Johnson says, after 56 came the moment of culture. Well, I'm saying, well, hang on a minute, let's be a little bit careful, because Thompson and Williams are writing things like, cultural policy, condition of the arts, the idea of culture, the Politics and Letters journal, etc. So it isn't all happening just from 56. The world doesn't start in 1956. There's stuff going on before these two. Right, okay. We know Williams knows about Richard Hoggart, because he writes a piece on Hoggart's use of literacy before it comes out, interestingly enough. Hoggart, and I cannot remember now, was it Hull Adult Education he worked for? Anyone? I can't remember which university Hoggart was. No, right, okay. It's likely, though, there's no obvious reason why the people reading the Tutor's Bulletin wouldn't have had some awareness of each other. The probability is they did. Okay, so it's interesting that they're coming from different angles, one in the CP, one outside the CP, and they're beginning to talk about culture. The one place where the only copy of this I know of in existence was with Eric Hobsbawm's copy. There was in 54 a week-long school done at a place called Netherwood. The CP historians held it. If you read a little bit of that, it's like a sort of a first groundwork of the whole idea of social history is being planned during that week, the first beginnings of what later came to be social history. And that then made me think of something else that took place 4 years earlier at Oxford, that where Williams was tutor of, a school that he ran called Literature in Relation to History. And at that, he gets about 12 historians and 12 literature tutors to talk about how literature and history relate. And I thought, well, that's interesting. In 54, he's then invited by the CP as one of only two non-CP people to come and talk at the 54 summer school. And I immediately thought, well, hang on, in Oxford, he brings together literature and history tutors to talk about how literature and history relate. 54, there's this amazing week-long school which begins to set some groundwork. You can see their tentative ideas. I'd love to get a copy of this, around social history. In between that, past and present was started. Okay. Tell me if I'm going on too long. 56 and all that. It's like 1066, you know what I mean. Okay, we know about Suez, we know about Budapest, Hungary, or we know sufficiently. Just to remind ourselves, that's when the Reasoner comes out. Logie already mentioned this local Budapest. Just very quickly, just to remind you, there were 3 copies of the Reasoner. Saville and Thompson both leave and are thrown out the CP, and it depends which way round you want to read it, whether you read the unpublished letters or whether you read the sort of published account, but they seem to have simultaneously been thrown out and left. When they leave, they then start up this astonishing publication, wherever it's gone to around the room, The Reasoner. Now, there was up to 140 pages an issue that. It's coming out 4 times a year. It's 57 to 60 it lasts. There are 10 issues in all. And that is not a small undertaking. That's a very, very big piece of work. They had no kind of distribution network, so they were reliant on people to literally sort of pass it on. And that's one heck of an undertaking. And that's being done at the very moment that he's writing the Making the English Working Class. What that journal does is draw together areas of poetry, of literary criticism, of international debate, of social history. It's a real journal that's I think we could probably learn some stuff from today still, personally, of how you pull together different strands of thinking, different ways of working, different types of subject analysis in a journal, and it's deliberately not trying to sort of set itself to be aligned to anyone's kind of group, party, approach or whatever. It's really meant to be something which is genuinely alone and non-aligned. We know more famously down here in London, the UNR crowd are 57 to 60 producing their dreadful name journey in the University Letter Review. I always thought there was a better name than that, but never mind. Which came out of St Andrews College, I think, Oxford, originally. Perry Anderson, of course, not Perry Anderson, what am I talking about? Raphael Samuel, with a crazy mad idea, not with Perry Anderson, it'd be very bad. Raphael Samuel's crazy idea of the partisan CAF, which sadly, if anyone's ever been round there, is now a sort of some kind of marketing company's office, unfortunately. Incidentally, the Partisan Cafe is only about 10 minutes walk from where Wolf Mankiewicz was editing Politics and Letters some years earlier. It's quite odd that. And where some years later the Socialist Society had their home as well. And where Merlin Press were also based. Merlin Press being the early people bringing in Lukács, etc. So that's a nice little area, whatever it's called, is the name of it, Fitzrovia, isn't it, the area?
Well, it's sort of Soho, Fitzrovia.
Yeah. Okay, so my interest is that, again, we have this new reason coming out. This is being edited, this enormous amount of work at the same time as the Making is being written, at the same time as the peace movement is on. Thompson's involved in the Yorkshire movement, and at the same time they're dropping down to London for these various big new left bashes, etc. And they have a galaxy of stars come and talk at these new left clubs. I gather that there's been an exhibition about it at what's the place opposite? Hang on, I'll remember in a second. Bishopsgate. Yeah, the Bishopsgate Centre had an exhibition, I gather, about the Partisan Club. I don't think anyone got to it, did they? No one actually got to it. They had one a while back, there was a photograph of it. But anyway, these various activities are all going on at the same time. Now, David Goodway has been talking about the Making of the English Working Class as well, and he obviously, and rightly, has been talking about the Yorkshire dimension of this. I think what I'm getting at here is that I couldn't possibly comment about the details of Thompson's classes in Yorkshire, but David Goodway is saying an awful lot of that, the Making comes out of those classes. I'm trying to sort of get the point that Thompson is involved a much wider figure than the Making the Working Class might suggest. It's not parochial in himself. I'm also trying to point out there's this huge amount of talk around the word culture. And Richard Johnson talks at the moment of culture. I try to push it back a little bit to the beginning of the 50s, or late 40s in fact. I think that it's Thompson's awareness of people like Williams, people like Hoggart, that something new is being said around this word culture, which I think is possibly being influenced as well by some emigres from the German area. Was Mannheim being read? Well, if you look at the long revolution, it's very interesting. Williams is clearly beginning to read the German scholarship. by this time. That came out in 61. So by then, Williams is certainly familiar with some of the German scholarship. It's quite interesting to see what he cites. It's quite a contrast to, say, Culture and Society a few years earlier. So I think there's more and wider international emphasis taking place. Right, to briefly finish up, New Reasoner ends in 1960, along with ULR, famously then joined together to make NLR. Those copies are down there. 61, Thompson does his two-part long essay on the long revolution. So by then, clearly the links are very much drawn, and that those two issues of NLR, I've got the Thompson essay in them. And so by then, there's very much the links are drawn. It would probably be worth rereading that essay for then seeing how that relates into the ideas in the making. Now, some of the essay is the 1840s he's particularly picking up Williams on. Remember, Williams talks about a whole way of life, and Thompson says a whole way of struggle. Sort of this difference in the two. Some of the essays focus on the 1840s, but the ideas in there would be interesting to look at, to see how then they relate to Thompson, who at the very same time, 1961, is writing The Making. Okay. He would have then, by then, have almost certainly read Culture and Society, he's obviously read Long Revolution, so the two of them, the ideas are intermingling. Richard Johnson, again, is a terrific source on all this, says how they were at a meeting, whatever the meeting was, I have no idea, but I forget. But they were at a meeting and talking about various ideas, and the sounds of the guns of Suez sort of in the far distance, as it were, and this the effect of that on the way people were thinking. And of course, David Williams, in his typical style, sort of said, well, you know, I've been writing about this. Here's some chapters of Culture and Society and the Long Revolution that he was tentatively putting together. Okay, so I'm suggesting that there's a much more complex combination of influences going on. I've by no means tried to suggest that, or hopefully not, that this is a kind of a way of explaining the making, but I just want to try and say that I think there's a lot more than just a parochial English element. I think there's a lot wider influences going on, and this word culture, and I think the importance of the book that I look at, Leon Williams. Yeah. Okay.
Thanks very much. Okay, so as promised, what we'll do now is we'll take a break of about a quarter of an hour, back at about 3:05 or so, for people to visit the facilities. Women's just out there, and the gents is on the 25th floor. It's just further down the corridor. All right, and obviously we've got there were still some biscuits remaining, and there was juice and water, so do avail yourselves, and we'll return in about 15 minutes for a discussion of the papers.
I think I shall go.
I want to say, why did your parents take you to PNG? To Papua New Guinea?
No, I went to Papua New
you
Guinea.
went?
I went to Papua New Guinea because I wanted to come to Europe, but I had no money, and I turned 21, so my father gave me £50. And I thought, where can I go with £50? I was divorced with a son, and you could apply for jobs in Papua New Guinea from Sydney. So I got a job as a clerk in the electrical undertakings department.
Yeah, fascinating. You said that many Hungarian Jewish people ended up in Australia after the war.
Yes.
I knew a guy called Johnny Kampfner. His parents had both been deported to you know where in 1944.
Yeah.
They were already in love, and each of them assumed the other was dead, and they then met by chance on the street in Budapest in 1945, and ended up in Marseille. And there were 3 ships. One was going to, which they all boarded by chance. You know, there was no.
Yeah.
One ended up in America, one ended up in Palestine, and one ended up in Australia. So their son was born in Australia. Yeah?
Well, we're all dispersed.
Yeah.
We're all dispersed.
Yeah. I think in the Gordon Riots, the black woman who was hung, she refused to open her mouth during the trial. I've read a lot about that's right. Yeah, I read a lot about the Gordon Riots because I taught a whole class about them every year. Well, as a way of hanging different historiographers, liberal, Marxist, anarchist,
I
etc.
simply cannot imagine that free black people in London or anywhere else would not have participated, given their histories, would not have participated in all of this. It just wouldn't make any sense at all.
Maybe you were just flustered, but 1772, it was Somerset's case.
Yeah.
And the judge who pronounced that Somerset could not be forced back to the West Indies, to slavery, was Lord Mansfield.
Sorry, yes, Lord Mansfield.
The funny thing about Mansfield is that he was a shareholder in slave estates. And he hesitated a hell of a long time before giving his judgment. He didn't want to give it. Yeah. What is also rather interesting is that there was a black woman in his house whose whose position
I've
is
seen
not
her.
clear. You know about that, yeah?
Yes, because I lived in NW5, not far from Hampstead Heath. So I would go for walks and go and look at Dido
where the Ratas were going for Cape Wood, etc. Yeah.
And I went to look at Elizabeth Dido. She was called many times when the painting was still there. Sorry.
Yeah.
Do you have my email address?
No, I don't. You don't have mine either. You write it. What can I write mine on? Just any scrap of paper that's not like to get thrown away. Right, I'll write it on it. I refuse to go on Facebook or anything like that. I just have an ordinary email. That's what it is.
This is the one at the university.
Fine. Marika.Sherwood at
SAS, School of Advanced Studies.
Oh, that's here.
Yeah.
Okay, so that's
Anything but advanced.
That's mine.
Okay.
I'm not often in Britain. It's not often in London because I'm based in Bremen.
What does GMX stand for?
I don't know what it stands for, but it gets there. It's usually GMXDE in Deutschland, but net. My wife, her father was a Pole who lived most of his life in Bremen. Met her mother in about 1920, I should think. Had a son. In 1939, he was mobilised into the Wehrmacht to take part in the invasion of Poland. My wife Barbara was born in 1942, and they were in Poland for a time, and then her mother didn't like being in Poland as a German, and so they got out in 1945. But Barbara had been born because of bombing in Western Germany. And her mother had looked out for a place to hide away from Bremen, where they ended up in until Barbara was 15 in 1957. And this was in a village near Kassel, and the school teacher was an undenazified bastard who called Barbara and her twin sister Untermenschen on the first day, and his name for Barbara from the first day was Little Ape. Effian, and they always got the lowest marks, except when he was old. Yeah?
Of course.
So what I'm saying, that's an example of how Nazism is imperialist racism directed to some extent, imperialist racism directed at Europeans, as well as against everybody else. Anyway, interesting. I hope you exchanged emails. Oh, thank you. Hope you exchanged emails with the two women you met this morning.
I'm sorry I have to go, but I'm much concerned about how we look at Africa.
Sure.
Because you have to know the early history of Africa, you have to know what there was there, you have to know what the trade in enslaved Africans meant.
Over centuries.
then you have to look at the Europeans sitting around that table in Berlin and saying, no, we'll draw the map there. No, that means you have too much iron, so we'll draw it there.
Yeah.
And then keeping the peace by pointing a gun at people, and I will use you. You can come into my military to point the gun at him, and we'll use him to point the gun at him. And then you have independence, and if we had all of these subterfuge people...
We'd have pretty awful elites as well. Well, we do anyway, but even more.
And who were what was MI6 doing?
Yeah, that's coming out nowadays.
What was MI6 doing?
Yeah.
And all of the others. And all of the others.
Yeah.
You know, I mean,
Well, it's still being done.
well, of course. I mean, from, what you hear of, what I found out about the Cato Street conspiracy and all of that all of that is manipulated.
Sure.
We wouldn't do that when we want to keep control of all of those raw materials.
Yes.
Okay, lovely to meet you anyway. Look up yourself.
Yeah. I'm sorry, I have to go.
Oh wow. It's coming on now. It's interesting. Yeah.
No, I've got to get back in time to get the last bus over. It's a 3-mile walk.
Oh my word. You really are rural.
Yeah. I had to walk to the station this morning because there was no buses.
Yes, we tend to forget that living in London.
Yeah. I mean, if the roads weren't the state they're in, I could cycle. And I can cycle in the day because I can move around the block.
Yeah.
It's not so light.
Now it's so bad.
Sure. Thanks.
I'm just not prepared to lose my life.
No,
exactly.
It's the appalling state of the roads. There's no repairs being done.
Whereabouts in Kingston?
I live outside of Faversham. That's on the way to Canterbury.
Right. My geography never was. Yeah.
It's quite an experience doing it.
I can't imagine.
Quite an experience.
Well, maybe that I've got.
go carefully.
Thank you. Well, thanks for coming. Thanks very much.
I don't get it. Not get it. What was the horrible accidents at the moment? I think the great selection, many people get it.
Try and improve this and then send it over.
Copy
it to you.
Yeah, please.
Possibly for...
Yeah, we'll be working this
I'm going to talk about
CXP.
Yeah, because you know by Christmas I was
started around Hungary, March
I don't know what their priorities are.
Well, they consistently approach me.
Oh, really? Well.
Yes.
So,
What is going on now is just
and they do.
It's interesting that Hungarian is not at all like German, because they came with the Austro
They do a little bit mashing nowadays to promote because they do a little bit to promote now more than they used to.
Yeah.
Focusing on
Hungarian
They also publish electronically.
Yeah. Even some
there was a great director,
left-wing publishers have started.
also he had some
It's different because they would have the costume.
Yeah.
They can't afford just to.
yes, every channel, yes, every channel,
Very democratic.
and then
for a small country.
and yes.
You got any strong feelings about it?
I like the capacity to be able to digitally research a book.
Yeah, true.
Basically.
True. You sometimes get crap.
Yeah, but even so, I mean, it's really handy to be able to say, well, what I really want to know is how does the author look at that particular subject or topic and then search. I mean, obviously I might get, but then just to see, well, look at what comes back. So that's how they're approaching that kind of thing. It's quite an interesting kind of dimension to looking at a book.
I'm just going to get rid of this.
Right.
But I mean, there's the issue about books, bookshops, and all that kind of stuff. It's I think they'll survive. I mean, it's just a question of working out a niche and then looking at the in a market economy, how where the pricing model sits and so on. There was a thing in the FT yesterday which
Any more juice left?
I don't know. They've got some apple juice there. Oh, there is.
That's great, thank you.
There's there. Right in front of you. No, here.
Yeah.
Oh,
Here.
now, okay, thank you.
There. You see? There's still one juice in there. FTS was it yesterday or the day before, saying that the sales of vinyl records were at their highest since 2001 and were increasing, and at least a third of the market for it was under 35.
Yeah.
People that would have been too young to have been brought up on vinyl records, because people just like the idea of the tangible record, the cover, the kind of things that we can do with ourselves. But it's kind of interesting. So I think books will continue to have it.
No, I don't think there's any risk at all. Books.
But it is going to. The market will change.
Oh yeah.
And certainly nowadays, on occasion, I'll buy. I'll get something down via electronically rather than having an offer be cheaper.
Yeah, that's true.
Very often half the price, but the point is, I probably wouldn't have bought the thing at all.
No. I wonder actually whether in time people might also do the way around, read it on Kindle or whatever, and then think, actually I'd like to have this in a hard form, so it could lead people on to buying books that way.
No, indeed.
The risk is that whether it will then also exclude a lot of the more marginal work that people then won't. I mean, okay, there never had been that's why it's marginal in the first place. But whether digitisation can have this sort of effect that work gets sort of pushed out, it does not regard as important, etc.
Possibly, but then there's also an issue about availability. I mean, it's quite difficult to get hold of quite a bit of left wing. Kind of
quality. Yeah, no, that's true.
You kind of forget, I suppose you can all.
Which is why I'm saying digitisation is so necessary. Yeah. But obviously, the powers that be prefer to have more of the mainstream work.
You can order it over the internet clearly and so on, but I mean, in a lot of places there are no left-wing bookshops at all.
No, absolutely.
And you perhaps wouldn't even be aware that stuff has been published. So getting it out there electronically can be quite useful.
If it can be done, it would be absolutely brilliant. I mean, the Amy Melbourne Trust is doing some good work.
Yeah. Well, obviously they've got all the back issues of New Reason, haven't they? And I think most of Marxism, if not all of Marxism today.
I think most of that, yes.
Yeah.
Yes. They've got probably the CP archive now. They've got
Socialist History, I'm quite sure that's on there. I don't think it's them. I think
no, I don't think the register's on there.
But it's really useful as a resource to be able to do that. But it's the kind of thing that requires careful thinking through without question.
Yes.
Money is involved somewhere. People are writing books, then by and large that's I'm sure except in the kind of area that I'm working. But I mean, people that are writing professionally, or it's their main source of income, and they will expect to be getting some money out of it, basically.
Fair enough. Yes.
Yes. I'm sure there's much money in labour history books.
No, that's true.
But how much Thompson was paid by Gallads initially?
That would be interesting, isn't it? I think I read that apparently John Savile was asked initially. It was meant to be this small, neat book, wasn't it?
It was meant to be I mean, I think that the book he contracted to write was meant to be a history of the English working class from whenever, right up to 45.
Yeah. It was a neat little textbook kind of thing.
Yeah, and he got as far as sort of the 1830s, and he got a volume of 1,000 pages.
Yes.
Four. Yeah, unless we get involved in a sort of fist fight, in which case we may either curtail or continue, depending on how people think. Gavin or something, draw them back into wall from outside.
Okay, all right. Yeah. And that, it's
That's great.
No, it's just so what happens is that it's recorded there, and they're meant to.
No, I'm not
stick on their website. It goes on the actual website. And then you can on social media or send people email.
Yeah.
So
yeah, okay.
And that was working fine. And this is up to the point where you
No, I appreciate that. Normally, when you write something, you
I mean, hopefully it will be sold in they're still recording it. Must have a huge backlog with recordings. Just hold on to it.
Yeah.
When you look at it, I think in the 70s now,
At some stage,
a robot back somewhere.
yeah, I guess I guess I'm he's in touch with Ruskin.
Where things are going here, the outside is
Yes, I mean, I think you can
Are you at Ruskin?
Yes.
No, you're at Ruskin. Yeah.
okay, let's
You're surviving your principal.
just have a.
Left yesterday.
She left?
Yeah, make her retire early. It's a great victory.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
You've lost your amnesia fascist.
Yeah.
Hooray!
He just said to me, are you surviving the principal at Ruskin? I said, she retired early.
Yes.
To spend more time with her family.
Did you see her
Poor
email?
family.
No, when?
Oh, she sent one out about
Last night.
11 o'clock last
Oh,
night,
wow.
thanking everybody for the gifts and
Their support.
Are you claiming some small credit for
We absolutely are, yeah, without doubt, yeah. Seriously, yeah. You see, you and the staff got rid of it.
Yeah,
I'll sit down with you and tell a story about getting rid of
Yeah.
vice chancellors and principals.
Sorry.
it's all right.
You will.
We've had more of a track record than
I don't know. Did you
John,
know that?
do you know at 5 o'clock, Stuart, the guy who looks after our website at 5 o'clock, spot on yesterday, he deleted his staff profile. I checked today and he did.
We can find out how many people signed it when we're asking everybody.
I can't. Yeah, we know. Probably is.
I've been working as a UCU, a junior UCU official for the last 5 years.
It's the only workplace I've ever worked at. It's a skill. I've never had a farewell for someone leaving not listed and I've seen them.
And then another
No farewell. Because some people know what to tell you. That's why she has to send out an email at 11 o'clock saying, "Thanks for the gifts."
Well, it does do that.
From the point of view of the you're there to solve it.
She said
You
that.
didn't go and say, elect me over the rest of you could put something else.
Yeah, the vice chancellor of the message.
Actually, John.
Sorry, I was relating to the.
Oh, sorry.
No, don't worry,
We
please.
should send a union email to that and tell her to fuck off. She's no longer working at this.
Sod it. Wait a minute, watch it, because I gather she only stayed on by threatening the college with a very expensive lawyer. Yeah. So if you told her fuck off, she'll probably get a very expensive lawyer to sue you for libel or something. You know. You've got to be a bit. You've got to be hypocritical. Yeah.
I said nothing to her. A couple of times she said to me, "Oh, I'm leaving. I've got obviously opened a conversation about it." And I said, "Yeah," and sort of moved on.
Good, okay, we're having marked that important landmarking. Whatever.
In the history of working class education.
Yes,
It is a bit.
This reminded. People might have seen the picture of John Hughes in The Guardian last week, which was a former principal of Ruskin, and I think arguably probably the last of the genuine principals. And of course his name.
Yeah, so John Hughes, is that the same one?
Yes.
I thought that wasn't sure.
Yeah. On the editorial board of the New Left Review.
Oh, right, yeah.
In the early periods, yes. So that's quite interesting. Okay, so Marika unfortunately has to go because she lives in the rural areas where public transport stops at 5 o'clock. But it's unfortunate. But we still have the other participants here, and I think what we'll do, I mean, it's up to the people here, obviously, but the security tell me that the building doesn't close until 10 p.m. So, and like when we're in the IHR premises where it's like a pub where you get thrown out, I think
at 4:30
on the Saturday closing time, but the closing time comes much later in the main building. But I think probably we'll aim to run through till about 4. If the discussion peters out, obviously we can finish earlier. If we get involved in a furious debate about something, we can continue on if people want to. But the floor's open for people to pitch in really and make what points they want. Either the participants or others. Several people have had to go, unfortunately, but
What's the other book? I'm aware E.P. Thompson wrote that as the most famous book. What are other books he wrote, like
Wicks and Hunters, Customs in Common. They're the two sort of probably the biggest known historical works. You've got a number of political work as well.
Yeah.
Yes. Yes.
And he also wrote a sci-fi novel called The Sick Chaos Papers, funnily spelled. And he also wrote a lot of poetry. Yeah.
And
I mean,
go on. No, I'm going to say, and of course the William Blake book at the end of his life.
Yeah. Witness Against the Beast about William Blake.
Yeah, so he wrote quite widely, and he wrote, as he said, on nuclear disarmament.
Oh yeah.
As well.
Yeah. I'd love to see this Alien Homage book. I mean,
it is around.
It's around.
Yeah.
You've seen it, right? I mean, I'm just fascinated that yeah.
Look, if you can't locate one, tell me and I'll send you my copy from Bremen. But
of course,
do a bash.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I'll have a look around for that. Yes.
His brother was a poet as well.
Yes.
Oh yeah.
Yes.
I mean,
big dispute as to whether, if he'd lived, would he have been a great poet or not?
Yeah.
When Frank was executed by Bulgarian fascists or royalists or whatever, they found a copy of Catullus on his body, in Latin. He was a joyful polyglot. Was Frank? I don't think you can say that about Edward. Yeah. So it is a huge question. I mean, he is obviously a colossal loss. Yeah. Not just to the Thompsons. Yeah. Incidentally, about Thompson in North Africa and later on in Italy, two things. I can't remember where, but in one of his things on, or in support of END in the 80s, he replies to an attack on him by the Daily Express hack Chapman Pincher. And he notes that Pincher's short biography says that Pincher, during much of the war, had conducted research on, had been involved in researching on anti-tank missiles or on anti-tank weaponry. And Thompson says, most of my research on anti-tank weaponry was conducted on the receiving end. So that's his service. And you're quite right about Williams, of course. I mean, he had an absolutely traumatic moment somewhere in Normandy where he sent one tank that way around a wood and went the other way around himself. And the first tank never re-emerged.
That's right. He does a fictionalised account of that in Loyalties. But he was overruled. Line came down from a senior officer, sent 2 tanks one direction, 2 tanks in the other direction of a vineyard or something like this. And of course, one of them came back. And
You never knew what happened. Yeah. By the way, Dorothy had a first marriage. Dorothy Thompson.
Yes.
As far as I know, she never said much about it. She simply said, I don't even know who the guy was.
I don't know. No. It was a wartime
mutual
marriage.
sexual attractions, he said.
Right.
Okay. So what?
It was a mutual sexual attraction. I mean, as though that was trivial.
Yeah.
I mean,
No high purpose. No.
Well, I don't even know if the guy was political. My instinct is that he was not.
Yeah, I think the same.
Yeah.
I got the impression it was a wartime brief marriage, and
Meaning getting a bit of fun before you got killed.
yeah, which,
Yeah.
lots of people did in wartime.
Yeah,
fair
my
enough.
friends did.
Yes. I don't know what this. Sorry.
Yeah.
It was possibly comparative, and she has this bizarre,
Yes.
unhappy affair marriage.
Yes.
This bloke who clearly is not in any way intellectually or ideologically inclined.
Yeah.
The same way she is. This is in Harari or Saul.
Yeah.
It was.
Right.
You're right.
She gets away from that and hangs out with German intellectuals and so forth.
Yeah.
And that's her route into communist politics, basically. But, one question I've got from listening to the conversations and discussions that we've had so far is that I'm thinking of Linebaugh and Redeker's book on the many-headed Hydra, which it just strikes me from thinking that it's sort of the other book, which is I found really exciting in terms of, you read The Making of English Working Class and it's exciting, and then Redeker, and it's exciting, I think, in the sense that it gives you. People have talked about the international dimension. Well, there's a book which really does, open up that dimension. And I think, it's not a criticism of Thompson, but the fact is it does come later, doesn't it? It's a product of the 80s or 90s or something, that book. And it just seems to me that's something which has taken this kind of historiography a step further. And that's not, as I really want to emphasize, it's not a criticism. It does mean, it's not as if Thompson wrote the last word, and I'm sure wouldn't have wanted to have claimed it. But that sort of, how do you really dig down into the roots and find out all the international connections? Well, it's a hell of a bit of,
Yeah, you're right. Redeker is still producing stuff of that dimension. He's just got a book coming out saying something fresh about the Amistad thing. I don't know whether it's going to be good, but on previous thing. I mean, Redeker is in many ways an American Thompsonian. But I mean, Thompson, in the preface of The Making, he is very clear that he has to focus, he has to cut his losses. He makes it quite clear that he's not writing about the Scottish or Welsh or Irish working class. He says, they have their own history, and I mean, the book is long enough simply about the English. I mean, that's what I've said to Marika if she stayed for this session.
But it's also about English men.
Oh yeah.
Oh,
apart from John
fair enough.
Southcott, I mean, where are those?
That is true.
Yeah, that's the perspective of the time, I think. And
So
that's the perspective of the time, possibly also because he thought that Darcy Thompson was writing about that, and he was quite clear. So he didn't write about the Chartists, so he could have gone on to that because that was what she was doing.
yes.
And he was going back, but I think just a couple of points on that. I mean, I was saying to Stephen, his initial contract for the book was to write a history of the English working class from the late 18th century to 1945. Right? But when he got to 1,000 pages,
Victor Gollo says
it's time to stop. So in a sense that was meant to be the first instalment of a much longer project, but it just got completely out of hand. So that's on that Linebaugh and Redeker, I'm not sure without checking about Redeker, but Linebaugh was a student of Thompson.
Yeah.
As were quite a number of sort of social students. Devil Kirk here in Manchester, John Rawls now sadly dead. Quite a number of people were in his period at Warwick.
They were the book Protest and Survive. It was written by a number of his students, or came together to do that.
So he's in a sense there is a Thompsonian school of history, which I don't think anybody's actually written about.
No.
There's an idea.
How to draw a line, right? Say who is. I mean, there'd be many borderline people.
Well,
just to pick up the point about how sort of the generation of Thompson and his colleagues were actually very international because of the war. That's their actual background. It strikes me that they never really were going to feel comfortable in the academic world. This is something that they never properly fit into, and therefore a Thompsonian school is never going to be a properly academic school, is it?
No. No, it wouldn't. No, it's always going to be heretical, and because the nature of the work, going back probably into the 30s, even the 20s, that they were coming from, just didn't fit that kind of academic program. I mean, they like this word interdisciplinarity, or it sounds good to sort of stick these modules together and this kind of thing, but it's not genuine. I mean, what they were doing was something very different, which was really discussing how you actually understood those novels in the terms of people's actual lives. So you were really integrating the senses around experience, around people's familiar popular history memories, and that form of work just isn't there inside the university. There isn't the space to do it, sadly, or very little space anyway, because it's all so sort of curriculum bound week by week by week that there isn't the sort of the opportunity. And I think one of the great losses to those tutorial classes is that you have people like Remodel saying, "Oh, we need to make them more organised and more university-like," and of course Thompson's saying, "Well, no, actually, we shouldn't." He's against this idea, and he likes the idea that his classes and various around Yorkshire do wander around. He likes the idea that they sort of go off on different tangents, etc. He's always like saying he wants them to argue back with him, this kind of thing. And you wouldn't get that with a group of 18-year-olds doing a literature degree in university. It wouldn't happen. So I think we've lost an awful lot, and I think we often forget that. I think we often say, "Oh, universities have expanded, how wonderful," but actually there's been losses too that gone on.
Tell me about it.
Yeah.
Yeah, that brings me on something I wanted to ask, which is about the metric, the actual way he writes about things, which seems to me just as pertinent to, a Thompsonian tradition as other kinds of. And one of the things that got me thinking about this was, on the one hand, something that was drawn out in a couple of pages, especially yours, about the sense in which these classes that Thompson ran and participated in somehow reflected all these myriad of groups and interconnecting groups that he's writing about at the same time. So in some strange way he's extending this tradition through, and he has an understanding of the tradition as being maintained by these meetings like these, really. So that's very important. And the other thing that got me thinking about it was this idea of messiness, that not only are practical struggles messy, but also actually writing about them is just as messy, and it's important to find a method appropriate to that messiness. Because the other thing that's been lost recently in universities is precisely dialectical method, right? That actually historical work about the same subject nowadays would be influenced by a kind of prevailing analytical working through of things, which would insist that actually each of these groups got their own chapter, but instead, no, that would actually do away with the sort of theme central to the whole work, which is the relationships, these ongoing overlaps and interminglings. So I thought that's something that we didn't really, or you didn't really pick up on, is the actual method of work, and how, and thinking about the 50th anniversary of the book and the sense in which it's created a tradition, particularly in social history. I wonder whether you agree that that's something that's also been lost. This messiness.
Go on, Peter, we were having this conversation. You say something.
Well, let me just add something. I know nothing about Thompson really. I just know this book, and that's all. I'm not a historian, and it was fascinating to get some of the information and stuff. But let me answer that by saying I went to a postgraduate, PhDs and PhDs at Oxford University. It's nice to dip in and out, to the madness of Oxford. But I mean, it is quite interesting as well because it's just so different. But it's in St Anthony's College, which isn't bad actually, because a lot of old decent left South Africans still there. William Byron, I don't know if you heard of him, We're all, you know, white, middle class, anti-apartheid activists and came to Oxford, and then it developed studies. So the great and good were there, and they were from all over the world, and I gave a talk. I was talking about losses and lessons to learn and things like this. And they were all quite shocked by that, because they were all writing about protests, these people, which was really good and interesting, but a couple of them, and maybe it's because I'm American, I don't know, but sort of that political science being an American. So how do you understand any protest when you do surveys, and do surveys of the people and ask them questions? And this was literally a couple of weeks after the big protest in Taxman Square, and this woman, through Skype, and the one's the technologist, American woman who's got a PhD, and she's working on it. She'd already done surveys of people in Taxman Square, and it was just... And for her, she hated my notion of messiness, because it played with her notions of surveys. And that was her approach. Now, I don't know if that's is anyone else, or whether it's an Oxford thing, or what, or if you find that in history. But that was just, you know, frightening the life out of me. And also because with it being Oxford, Anna being having a PhD, she was just so fucking confident that she was right. It frightened the life out of me, to be honest. She was about 25. But you know the way they can do that. You can't, I mean, I don't think you must be, it really is like it was Cambridge, but it is, isn't it? It's just that Oxford way, you know. But that's what they were talking about protests. So they didn't like messiness.
I don't think it's just Oxford, actually.
No, possibly not. I think there is something about Oxford, but she didn't like messiness, and it was that, I think maybe political science, I don't think you find it elsewhere, but that's where some of them were coming from. I don't answer your question, but I mean, that's just something that was interesting.
Well, I think we should recall that we're not confident that we're necessarily right here. Just in case anybody thought which is why we're having the discussion, so we can work out, you know, change of ideas and so on, you know, what would be interesting to pursue and what not. So can I just pick up on the method thing? I mean, I take the point about the modern academy. I mean, it is, you know, increasingly there's been a long battle here about how to bring together you know, seminars that deal with essentially the same kind of subject area, or papers from the same area will appear in totally different seminars, and there's never any crossover, which has been sort of picked up a little bit in recent years around with the sort of internet and a bit more interchange, but it's still quite, you know, it's like a silo kind of thing, which has got a really familiar kind of aspect of neoliberal kind of thinking, where, you know, the interchange between doesn't happen as often as it should do. But I mean, Thompson's method was, you know, the most traditional, I think, of you know, research historians' method. I mean, he wasn't a quantitative historian looking for the data, although there is elements of the economic side of the making where there is some of that. But I mean, it was mainly going around local record offices, I think, over the years when he was with that WA tutorship in Halifax, just using his spare time, I guess, whenever, to go and look through what he found in local record offices, make a note by hand on, I don't really know, I think cards, I would guess, would be the normal thing, and then, you know, stick it together in that massive book. I mean, the actual focus to do that. I mean, nowadays, you know, I guess nearly everybody would do it on a computer of some kind. It makes life much easier, but I mean, he's doing it literally by hand. So when you think about, you know, how that book is written, and, you know, you can look through it and see, you know, volumes, footnotes to his sources. I mean, it was, and yeah, the moral economy, which I spoke about at the beginning. I mean, he looked both these essays on the moral economy. You know, the sort of academic apparatus around it is substantial in terms of his ability to quote this or that food right, who did what in a particular at a particular time in a particular place. You know, the whole thing is empirically underwritten to an enormous extent, but that was just hard slog, which I think explains in a way why, you know, when he took during his bit of political activism around the E&D and so on, he stopped doing the historical stuff by and large, and you can see why. because it just was not the physical time to do that. Now, I mean, these days, I'm not sure that would be, certainly wouldn't be acceptable in the academy. They say, well, the ref is looming. Get on with the research.
What year did he go to Warwick?
65.
So it's 2 years.
Like
2 years after the making, and that's when E&D starts up 70s, isn't it?
No, it's later.
I think it's early 80s.
Early 80s.
It's around
Okay.
cruise missiles.
Pershing.
It comes from the same period as Green Commons.
Right. No, because what I was just trying to piece together was any connections there. And the Warwick people who put together Protest and Survive, one of them there, I mean, you probably have David Goodway will say more about this, but there is a piece at the beginning which does talk about the classes in Yorkshire. Thompson used his students to go off and find some of the material that went into the making. And I think a lot of the leads came from the students. So it came out of those classes and they were telling him where things were. This seems to be what was going on. So the method, in a sense, was offered by the circumstance of the teaching. That probably wouldn't have happened to the same extent or the same way in a place like the Warwick situation. So I think it's partly because there he is going to small towns and villages. And I think there's a really interesting point about his writing of these groups in the early 19th century. And here they are, their 20th century form, except in this form now it begins as formal adult education classes, which the whole question around learning that I know recently Keith has spoken about, in a much more informal way. They were learning in the early 19th century without the word classes or adult education or whatever being there. So, yeah.
I think your question is a fantastically important one, and I'm interested in sort of going a little bit beyond what Keith's saying in terms of, I take the point about how he's somebody who really wanted to go to the original sources. I remember the story of when, by a miraculous chance, he gets to discover the remaining archive of the Muggletonians, which is, it's like the best moment of his life. Here is something which has been preserved by unbelievable set of circumstances, and he's one of the few people on the planet who actually knows who the Muggletonians are. And here he is. Here is the entire history of them preserved, and it's just a fantastic moment. Not everybody would have this reaction. He's somebody who really believes you go to the source. Then the question is, but how do you decide what's relevant? How do you actually string it together? And for me, it's really the point that people make. It's about how you go on the inside. You talk about the real life experiences of real people in the middle of, and for him it is the word struggle. It is that's where you don't go for the way of life, you go for the way of struggle. And he constantly looks. That's where the dialectics comes in for me. Is where are the battles? Where are the contradictions? I mean, sort of you look at the sort of the turmoil that the book covers a 60-year period or so, roughly speaking, 1760, 1820 or something like that. Is that sort of approximately that sort of period? That itself is a period of revolution. Most of the industrial cities of North are doubling every 15 years in size. They're just a period. The technology's changed by 1830 something. Majority of people working in the mills of Manchester are actually women. That's somewhat. There are these very, and somebody who has got this ability to actually focus in on where the heart of the struggle is at any moment, and then finding out who was really doing the business, and then really getting their words and their actions and constructing a story out of it. And it just seems to me that's something which, precisely as you say, has gone. And if I just very quickly say, you see, I think there really is a job of work for somebody to go to Taksim and talk to the people who are involved, but talk to them what they actually did and said. Don't ask them bloody survey questions.
Yeah, exactly.
But you know, I can see the people who've invested in survey methodology see you as the enemy. You know, you're challenging their academic status.
Did Thompson, did he write in his work about the Chartist movement?
No.
No. You know, that was a great movement for English.
As Keith said, he left it to his wife.
Yes,
He wrote about that.
Who does?
No.
Yeah.
She wrote about women in charge.
She wrote. Well, she wrote.
That's a one-volume.
She did actually. Yeah, you're right. Sorry.
Yeah, she did the early Chartists. Yeah.
Yeah, until Malcolm Chase, more recent volume. So no, he made it. Thompson made it pretty clear that he was going up to. Yeah, there's a brief mention of just the beginning of the Chartist period in the making and so on. He does stray a little bit into the 1830s, but his research agenda, which is why we get the moral economy, was when he'd done the making the working class, he went back, not forward, because forward is where Dorothy Thompson was. Of course, he did also touch upon the period after the Chartists. Because he wrote that
Homage to Trump and also Warren Morris.
Yeah, indeed. So he touched on the later Victorian period, and then he went back into the 18th century. He didn't look at that period from 1832 to 1860, shall we say?
No. I read about some memory person, Charles Napier, who tried to put the Chartists down. I was an English soldier. The British Army opposed it, didn't they? They fight against the Chartists. Or do they not? Was that Peterloo?
No. Napier is the commander of British forces north of England in the 1838 to 1839. He disguises himself and goes to the big Chartist rallies in the Korean War. Says, I like the ideas, but if you really think this movement's going to be able to take on the forces I command, forget it. He's an interesting man.
He went to India later.
Of course.
This is the same Napier.
I think if he had written about it, he would have taken Napier into the story, because he is somebody who sees history as class struggle. You've got to look and see what both sides.
He had some sympathy with the Chartists, didn't he? Did Napier have sympathy with the Chartists?
Yes, well,
he had sympathy from a ruling class position.
As he said, like the idea. The actuality was worrying him, but. Of course, the other point is, and just touched on that. I mean, John Saville, who was, Thompson's collaborator in the Eastern period, did write extensively about the Chartists. So, he wrote about Ernest Jones, he wrote in 1848. So, again, Thompson may well have felt that there are people working on this area.
There's also the question of the CP historians group. They've got Hilton, Hill, medieval, early modern, got this working. Hobsbawm there, the big figure for later on. They were, I think, trying to push. There was this business about the CP history does well in the 17th century, well in the 19th century, it gets a bit stuck in the 18th century. So they were trying to push people back and pull Christopher Hill forward. I mean, Christopher Hill's, Industrial Revolution book, Reformation, Industrial Revolution. That's very long, sort of textbooky style of work. But I think that Thompson is also trying to meet this felt need to look at the 18th century, so he is working back sort of in that direction.
For whatever reason, I remember a very amusing moment. It must have been 1967. It was the LSE Socialist Society. I wasn't at LSE, but I was around it because I was working on empirical documents in the basement. And most of the leading people there were either in IS or going that way very soon. And Thompson came along to talk, I can't remember what about, and towards the end of the discussion, he let drop the fact that he was going into the 18th century.
Yeah.
And a lot of people piped up and said, "But this is terrible. Why did you go forward and do Chartism, etc., etc." You know, and you say, "Well, Dorothy and all that." Well, you can check with that on Steve, via Steve Jeffries, who was definitely one of the objectors. Yeah.
Right.
I mean, why did you go forward into class struggle? What's the 18th century about, for Christ's sake?
Yeah.
I mean, people reacted as though he'd said a rude word at a vicarage tea party.
Yes.
And we haven't actually mentioned Whigs and Hunters, the early 18th century.
I mean, he discovered, or helped to discover, struggles that nobody had known existed.
It was that nose, that sort of, you can smell them, I think, is the point. You can,
There is, talking about nose and smelling, there is a story, I don't know whether I got it from Julian Harbour or from Sheila Rowbottom, or possibly both, I don't know. Dorothy and Edward were motoring through Halifax, and they passed something like a working men's club or something. Noticed, in those days you drove a bit slow sometimes, that somebody was bringing old books and documents out to the dustbin. So they stopped and found, that's your nose, and rescued stuff. I mean, that's relevant to Ruskin.
Yeah.
But I want to go a bit further, because actually I think that, I'm just thinking, you suddenly made me think of the other people who drove around looking for stuff, which were the Fraus. Eddie Frau was a great man in his own way, but he's a crack historian. He writes a lot, but it is pure narrative. There is absolutely no sense of class struggle from above and below and up to nowhere.
Which is funny for a lifelong CPA,
and that's what Thompson has got. This is the thing about the method. He really is. Maybe everyone's idea of dialectical method, but my God, he has a method, and that's what strikes me as what makes the book. 50 years later, I only read it properly last year, and I didn't feel that it had aged at all. I mean, obviously I don't know a lot of what's been written, but I do feel it. It's catchy. It still seems to me a book which springs off the page in a way that.
So, where do you think he got that from? Was it do you think it was from Marx? I mean, or was there other things? Because Marx is obviously talking about the big picture and the minute life as well. Or I mean, Trotsky's Socialist Revolution does that as well.
Yeah, it does.
I mean, are there other things of influence?
This also relates to that thing about the English context. And, for Marx, England was the special case, but also the kind of first case. Bizarrely, that was the contradiction of work. And that's why England was an especially important case study. So that's perhaps why people like and Thompson himself felt that actually it was important to understand the dynamic in England, because it would actually, for people reading that material from elsewhere, it would actually formulate various problems that could, which would put you in a position to understand development of capitalism at a European level and global level.
If you're being driven by some of the economic historians who are Ashton, and the economic historians are saying, the prize model for the development of capitalism is England, Britain, then if you're then following people like the Hammonds, maybe, Tawney, you're going to want to be answering some of the economic historians' way of doing it. So you're going to be drawn into looking at England. Yes, there's this model. I can remember this too, being told, Britain is the first model example. Apparently American economic historians are keen on Britain too for that reason. They like to sort of see this as the laboratory, as it were, how does industrial capitalism start. And I think your point is about the making still being a very real book. Well, if we're then looking at places where that industrial takeoff is in the sort of position of, you see what I mean? That yes, it is going to speak because it's going to actually say things.
Well, actually, on the third, of course, there's Peter Mathias's book, The First Industrial Nation, which is about economic history of Britain.
A bit later.
Sorry?
A bit later.
I mean, but the point about it being a special case, it's there in the title, which explains what it is. But as far as Thompson's concerned, I mean, I think one of the things is the fact that he comes from the literary tradition.
Yeah.
And I think, I get the impression, I can't prove this, but that he might well have started with sort of autobiographies and so forth, and tales that stories that the working class are telling. It's that gets him into this history from below thing, because he then sort of develops on that.
That's logical. That would make sense, because working class fiction writing is quite a slow process to develop. An autobiography or biography,
a
memoir, yeah. They are sometimes sort of the working class equivalent of, you know, the middle class novel kind of thing. And sometimes in writing it comes through in that format. I know this from looking at the contrast with the working class writing in South Wales, and it comes through much later than the English form. So you could be on something there, perhaps the biographical, autobiographical, and how many of these class students had done their own bit of writing tucked away under the bed, as it were. And he was picking up his ideas from that as well. You're absolutely right. I mean, that's the point I was trying to bring up, that there's past and present, there's essays and criticism, and I was bringing out a Cold War dimension, but there is very much the scrutiny is in the middle there. Scrutiny is hugely important, it's massively influential on Thompson. There's Lewis's Culture and the Environment, which was quite a radical revolutionary book. It's widely read in the other education movement. It's, of course, the critic of the English department at Cambridge at the time. We remember that as well, that Lewis is on the outside, and eventually he actually wins the argument. I think put together, I'm just thinking of Aaron Williams for a second. He writes a piece, Use of English or something like it's called, on how would you put together a culture and environment course. And he uses people like the Hammonds, Tawney, etc. for the general history for this. He's got Levis, I. Richards for the sort of practical criticism, that sort of work. So, if you've got those combinations, the literary input of how you go to the word experience would then rub off in a way into the social history of going inside and finding the experience there. This emphasis on the subjective taking of the text that comes out of some people like I. Richards. How do we respond to the word on the page? Apply that historically, how do you respond to the experience of machine work coming in the factory work? So, you might... Right.
Just so you remind me, of course, there's a New Left Review under Thompson's editorship used to do those things about people writing about their work.
That wasn't just under his, it carried on into the Anderson era.
But he started it. I mean, it's so the work that the person counts out of the pen. So he is actually, I mean, and this of course it starts before English working class is actually published and you write it. So it obviously is something he's interested in.
Can I take up another angle, which is that I think Thompson, well, as I said, he's not just interested in what happened, which is Hobsbawm's idea of history and what the object of historical research and discussion should be. It's also about the potentials, and that's the context for causes which were lost in England, etc. I mean, you use the word takeoff, which of course is a Rostovian word. The takeoff in itself is sustained growth, stages of economic growth, as though, once you analysed all the stages that Britain, England plus South Wales plus Glasgow had come through, then you had a recipe for an anti-communist manifesto, which is the subtitle of the stages of economic growth, that all countries needed to go through, all 6 or 7 or however many, which of course we can all agree is total codswallop. And anyway, what about the Prince Bishop Frick of Liège? But nobody mentions that in the 18th century. Thompson is saying it's all much more open, much more to be struggled for, etc.
Yes. Yes.
I mean, really, the Rostow brothers, I mean, they came unstuck over Vietnam, you know, and garbage in, garbage out. I mean, you know, and in a sense, they're the forerunners of Karl Rove, you know, I mean, you know, only Karl Rove being a megalomaniac, you know, when we are an eponym, when we actually remake reality, you know, that's much less conceptually sophisticated than Walter Whitman Rostow, you know, or Eugene V. Debs Rostow, note the names. Yeah.
Let me just read this question from Twitter. Did E.P. Thompson underestimate the influence of structural processes in history? Says Nick J.G.
With another way, you know, just simply putting an assumption into the discussion.
Yeah.
Structural processes, as if somehow we all agree we know what that means.
Yeah, well said.
Well
said. Another reason why I'm glad I'm not on Twitter or Facebook. There's crap markets.
You probably have a friendship with that other great Western historian, Eric Hobsbawm, who died a few months ago. Did he have a link with him, Eric Hobsbawm?
Oh, God, of course, all the time, yeah.
Oh, yes, yeah.
Sparring partners, friends, comrades.
Yes, if you look at the Hobsbawm writes in Rebels and Causes the story of the historians group. Used to meet over near Mark's house, an Italian cafe over there. Dorothy was more involved, but certainly Hobsbawm would have known E.P. around that.
And of course, one of the copies of the review that came out actually has a review by Eric Hobsbawm in it.
Yes, it does, yeah. I forgot. Oh, of a book about Chishichi Suzuki about the SDF.
Yes.
The rather
No, it was actually a bit Heidemann and the SDF.
Yeah.
Yes. Okay, it's a bit Heidemann and the SDF is this review. But anyway, it doesn't matter. Yeah. Okay. But no, I would like to take the time now and look more carefully at the making and at Thompson's review of the Long Revolution, and just see what might come from those things. Because it does seem to me that Thompson picking up the ideas of culture and the environment from Leavis might well be a real major influence on how he's looking at working class. If there's additional Marxist inverted commas to look at sort of working class institutions, the labour history approach it as was, and he's looking at it with this word culture, subjectivity, experience, that would come from the scrutiny side, I suspect, to some extent. But also through the classes, actually realising, oh my God, people really are talking about what they've gone through. So he's got the real live subjective experience there.
You have, of course, got an element of that from mass observation.
Oh,
which is something obviously completely different to coniphrase.
Yes.
Well, that was Tom Harrison found it.
Etc. Yes.
I met his son years ago. Yes, he was a great man. And one of the pioneering works of organisation of its kind.
Yeah. And the point was, every month getting people not just to listen to what people around them were saying about the topic, but also what they felt sometimes. Sometimes they did say what they felt.
That would be interesting.
I can't prove that, but
that would be interesting.
I don't know if this is a fair way of putting it, but Morris is what in today's terminology is sometimes called a cultural icon. William Morris is somebody who is perceived out. I don't know whether this was true back in the 1950s. I think everybody thinks furniture and wallpaper and so forth things. And he then goes and writes a book, 800 pages long, which actually completely relocates the heart of Morris into somebody who basically a Marxist and a revolutionary socialist. And I just feel that there's something there in terms of he looks at culture in a way where you actually have to say, well, dig a bit more, and you find that real people are battling over all kinds of things. It can't be seen. I mean, I find this phrase "way of life" it's something which Thompson is always sort of criticising.
Well, yes, but at the same time, remember, Williams is taking on the whole sort of Cambridge notion of culture. And he's saying, well, just a moment, my grandparent, my grandmother picked stones from the road, etc., for a shilling or whatever. So although he uses the term way of life, he's very aware of how he represents, in a sense, of the work he's got to do coming from a Welsh working class background. So I don't think, I see your point, but I don't think we should see Williams as somehow discounting struggle. He admits that perhaps the term he was using at the time didn't really come through. I think Williams isn't really trying to do the same thing. I think he's trying to say something rather different about culture, at a more abstract level. But it's there. I mean, his talk of his Welsh working class background, it comes out in the novels. That's the thing with Williams. You've got to start with the novels, and then you come back to the analytical work. It's that way around. Di Smith's wonderful book, Warrior. Warrior in the Making. Warrior's Tale, is it? I mean, he's done the work. He spent years and years writing that. He was all waiting. When's it going to be finished? But he's gone back and he's done the work and shown how the whole question of the railway, the way the railway links into the mining areas and out into the industrial Midlands, the enclave, his essay on 1926, and he talks about how this group of this half a dozen or a dozen people, whatever, working at Pandy railway station, well, what were they? They were part rural because they would have their own kind of work. They would do occasional work for the large gardens or whatever. But they were also industrial workers, part of an industrial working class movement, and how 1926 experience of that comes out in Border Country. So Williams is writing about it in a different way. But Thompson, perhaps this is more Thompson's style. It's more the sort of the sword is drawn as you go into battle, as it were, as the idea of struggle. Yeah.
On Morris, I mean, the sad thing about the Morris book is that it first came out in '55. You know, less than a year and a half before Thompson's flaming exit from the CP. And he had given hostage to fortune. You know, there is stuff about tooth grating stuff about Lysenko and about Stalin. So of course there had to be a second edition. But anyway, he did also rethink it. You know, the other thing is that there has been an impact of the argument that, or reverberation from the argument that Morris wasn't just an aesthete, which is obviously we can all agree is Codswallop. I gather that in the Venice Biennale, a British artist did a large wall painting, I think, could be wrong, of William Morris carrying a supersized William Morris carrying the enormous yacht of a Russian billionaire and smashing it into the quayside. So that's some kind of a reverberation, Yeah. I don't know how he got hold of it, but yeah.
I've got to go. Can I ask a question? It's not a strange one. It's a historian as well. If someone was to write a making of a working class now, what working class should they be looking at?
You mean which country?
Yeah, or it needs to be.
Well, if it hasn't been, I remember Schuyler Marx telling me that Althusser had wrecked a lot of mines in South Africa, but if there are still a lot of good South African Labour historians, surely that'd be one place to start. And there have been starts made by Charlie. What's his name?
Katrina Navikas, who's at it's called now Hatfield, somewhere up on the North, who does a lot of stuff on around sort of the Thompson period. She can find, she's got a blog and so on. Said, I think earlier this year, that if Making was going to be written now, it will be written about Mumbai and Sao Paulo. This is the point about that the struggles that Thompson talks about still being played out in those cities.
Not to mention China.
I thought that's the obvious, but I just wasn't sure. I just wanted to answer.
That's a really, really good point, Brian. We'll probably, I think, wind up the formal session now. Some people need to get off. Just on that cliff thing, I lived in Worcester for a period, so I knew, and Thompson's lived in just outside of Episcopal, or whatever the bloody hell it was called. and strange English place names. And so, I mean, I used to see him, you know, quite frequently. We'd go to beer in the Fabia's Arms and by Worcester Cathedral. I mean, it was obvious, discussing with him, that he had very little understanding of what, you know, where things like IS were coming from. As he used to say, well, you're an anarchist. No, I'm not an anarchist. Because he just couldn't see. You know, he assumed that if you were making the kind of, he assumed it was sort of libertarian. You know, his outlook was formed by that 56 period, I think, and obviously he reacted against it.
Yeah, I mean, he says some very sympathetic things about solidarity and the socialist brotherhood in poverty of theory. And I mean, the last time I saw him speak was actually at a political meeting, a CND meeting in Battersea, where there were a load of strong SWP were there. He actually, from the platform, was arguing we need to be moving, for the anti-nuclear, we need to be moving into industrial work, getting the working class on ourselves. And we were saying the same things. I mean, in the end, he said, you know, I'd like to congratulate the SWP for putting the case really, really well. He, you know, well, maybe he'd sort of caught up with things like that.
Maybe it's pissed when you spoke to him.
Wasn't one of his kids in the SWP at one stage?
I don't know. Well, his granddaughter is, because I know that.
That's a bit later.
Yeah,
Kathy's granddaughter.
Sorry?
Kathy's granddaughter.
Kathy Porter is who wrote the biography of Thompson.
Good heavens.
Just been reissued.
Wow.
Okay, that's an interesting note on which to conclude. So,
Actually, speaking of bookmarks, you should have wasn't it?
yeah, that's So,
Thank you very much.